Arabian Winds, by Linda Chaikin. Chapter 11. When Allison heard the birds taking their morning bath in the garden's fountain, and she saw the sunlight glinting through the rattan blind in the little bedroom, she remembered where she was. She raised her head, fully awake now, smelling freshly brewed coffee and eggs. A smile softened her face as she sat up, tossing aside the thin coverlet and snatching her wrapper from the foot of the bed. She was a guest in the home of Miss Rose Lyman, a middle-aged Jewish woman with dark brown hair and friendly eyes. Her warmth of hospitality almost made Allison feel as if she, too, had Jewish blood and had come home to visit relatives. Then it occurred to her, I'm in Jerusalem, city of the great king, the land where my Lord became my Savior. She didn't move, for her heart was pounding as she let the full meaning of her location sweep across her soul. A host of biblical heroes marched across her heart. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Samuel, David, Isaiah, Peter, James, John, the Apostle Paul, the persecuted church. Now war loomed on Palestine's horizon. What waited in the whirlwind of dust and sand and in God's purposes for history? She turned her head toward the open window, where the bird's song cheered her. It had been night when she and David had arrived. The city had seemed old, dusty, and not very different from Aleppo, but it was different. This was the chosen city, chosen by God in the past, chosen by Him for the future. To this beloved city, Jesus Christ would one day return and reign, one glorious day. She recalled how tired she had been last night, but even then weariness hadn't dampened her growing enthusiasm for being here. She was pleased now that Major Holden had insisted she come. She remembered how Mrs. Lyman had welcomed her to stay as long as she needed, and David too. Of course, Rose Lyman had expected him. He had written to her from London, and she had corresponded with him as a mother writes her absent son, telling him of the political climate in Jerusalem, of the band of Jews who worked for some manner of independence and rule of their own in the city. David Ben-Gurion was their spokesman, and Mr. Ben-Gurion knew important people in the British government: Lord Balfour, Chaim Wiseman, and others.
And that's Chaim.
Chaim Wiseman.
Yeah, all those names.
And others who were friendly toward Zionism. Last night she had told them they would meet Mr. Ben-Gurion perhaps in a day or two, just as soon as it seemed safe for a gathering in her home. The Turkish officials were fiercely against any independence movements of Jews or Arabs, she had said. They treated both groups as outcasts, imprisoning many Arabs from Turkey who had also come to organize for freedom from the Ottoman Empire. Allison glanced about the sparkling room with its little white cotton curtains, handmade furniture, and a vase of yellow flowers from Mrs. Lyman's garden. A plate of figs, dates, and sesame candy stood on an olive wood table. Allison drew in a deep breath and hurried to the door. Last night Mrs. Lyman had told her that the door opened to a flight of stone steps that would take Allison up to the flat roof, which was used much like a terrace. There she would look out on Old Jerusalem. She might even be able to see the temple site. Allison didn't know what she expected as she climbed the steps, feeling the bright Jerusalem sunshine sprinkling her head and back like a warm blessing. She smiled to herself. Did she think she might be transported back in time to see the Lord riding into the city on a donkey? Hosanna. Right? Hosanna?
Yeah.
She whispered, Hosanna to the Son of David, to the Son of God. But when she reached the rooftop, where some tables and chairs were pleasantly arranged, the smile vanished from her face. The dome of the rock, the Muslim shrine, glinted brazenly among the site where the temple had once stood.
I've seen it.
Minarets dotted the skyline, and to her ears came the unwanted cry of the
museum.
Spell
it.
M-U-E-Z-Z-I-N.
Museum. Yeah.
Museum.
Like that.
As the Muslim call to prayer echoed in the city. She was still standing there when a child's voice interrupted her thoughts. Happy morning, Miss Allison. My mother says, come. It's time for breakfast. And she has a surprise for you. I know what it is, but she told me to say nothing. Allison turned from the rail with a smile tinged with sadness. Little Mrs. Lyman's little boy, Benjamin, watched her with stark curiosity in his soft brown eyes. He was a comely child, though small for his 12 years. He was now a son of the law. He had told her last night, since he had undergone his bar mitzvah last week, and would rattle off portions from the Torah. Proudly he had announced to her that he had been born in Jerusalem. But Mother was born in New York. We came here to live with Uncle Samuel. He used to be a rabbi, but he isn't anymore. They won't let him. Even my bar mitzvah had to be done in secret. But Mr. Ben-Gurion says all that will change. Do you think it will, Allison? She had smiled. May God grant it, Benjamin. But what happened to your father in New York? He died in an accident in the warehouse where they made shirts. I don't know exactly how, but he got caught in a machine. Miss Lyman called up from below in the small stone courtyard behind the house. Benjamin, did you find Miss Allison? He ran to the rail and peered over. Yes, we're coming down now. I told her you had a surprise for her. He looked at Allison and smiled. Better hurry. I will. Caught up in his excitement, she quickly descended the steps to her room to change. 10 minutes later, Allison opened the door into the main section of the house and was greeted by the homey fragrance of biscuits. The Sabbath is over, said Benjamin, meeting her, so we can have biscuits with honey. It's my favorite. She followed the boy through a small sitting room and into a dining room that opened onto the courtyard. The citrus trees that grew in tubs were green with waxy leaves, and the oval shapes of oranges and limes were nestled within, ready for picking. A garden of herbs grew in a neat wooden square.
Does that say the trees grew?
The citrus trees that grew in tubs were green, with waxy leaves, and the oval shapes of oranges and limes were nestled within, ready for picking. A garden of herbs grew in a neat wooden square, showing varied colors of greens, grays, and reddish textures. Then she stopped short, astounded. Neil? Came her breathless question, as if seeing a mirage. The man who stood there was no mirage. His thick, sandy hair, the scuffed collar of his cotton shirt, was in need of a trim. Beneath heavy golden brown lashes, his brittle blue eyes were like Leah's. His desert tan face reflected the outdoorsy good looks that had originated with his deceased father. I thought the smell of my cooking would rouse you. Good morning, you lazy creature. She let out a cry, a smile appearing as she exclaimed, Neil! He laughed, opening his arms to give her a brotherly hug as she rested him. Welcome to our home away from home. I see Rose has made you comfortable. Oh, how good it is to see you, Neil. How dare you frighten us so with your disappearance at Aleppo? Yes, I can explain about that sometime. I assume this isn't the moment, she said. More secrets, I suppose. Huh? Well, I'm learning to live with him. But it isn't at all easy. You might have let us know you were safe. Yes, I'm sorry about that. But David tells me you've met Major Holden. She looked at him, wondering if this was his way to ask how much she knew. Yes, a man of all trades, she said meaningfully, thinking about his roles as colonel, a professor, and now a British major with Cairo intelligence. Any word of his arrival yet? Then you do know, he said quietly. I wasn't at all sure. He told you? And Leah? Leah. Surely David had told him. Yet his outward appearance contradicted any grief for his sister. And she tensed, believing he didn't know. Apparently David had been unable to bring himself to tell Neil, deciding to leave it to her. Leah explained what she felt was safe to disclose. Major Holden helped David and me escape Jarablus, but he's rather uncooperative about cluing me in. Oh, that was her. Leah explained what she felt was safe to disclose. Major Holden helped David and me escape Jarablus, but he's rather uncooperative about cluing me in. We're expecting him tonight, if all goes well, Neil said. If all goes well. Please, Lord, it has to. Please protect him. She was thankful for the diversion of the cup of hot tea Neil handed her. He watched her thoughtfully, as though he guessed She had troubling news, but wasn't ready to share it just yet. Brett will be stationed in Cairo, he went on, so I suspect we'll be seeing a lot more of him, especially if war breaks out. You'll have plenty of opportunity to learn what's going on. Unfortunately, neither Leia nor I are at liberty to go into detail. Leia nor I are at liberty to go into detail. Brett could, if he wished. Perhaps he doesn't want you involved. Those in intelligence can be brutal when it comes to clamping down on wagging tongues. I can explain some things, and I think that goes both ways, but this isn't the time. We'll talk later, if we can get away. She nodded that she understood and fingered the hot cup, keeping her gaze averted. David came in from the courtyard with Mrs. Lyman and Benjamin. I hope Neil is making you feel at home, said the smiling woman to Allison. David and I wanted to give you time alone together, but Benjamin here couldn't wait to see your response to our surprise. One would think he had arranged it just for you. I'm delighted, said Allison with a laugh. Seeing Neil safe and indulging his favorite pastime has restored some joy. My favorite pastime is eating, not cooking, said Neil lightly, using the spatula to flip the cake with expertise. Benjamin clapped, and Neil said for Allison's benefit, and these, cousin, are delectable indeed. If you haven't tried potato latkes
Oh, I want some.
with a smidgen of Rose's preserves, you haven't lived. We usually have them at Chanukah.
Hanukkah.
Oh.
That's Hanukkah.
But it's spelled Chanu.
I know.
Okay, so it's just a different spelling of Hanukkah. We usually have them at Hanukkah, said Benjamin, and he quoted, The temple was under siege, and there was oil enough for only one day to light it, but by miracle it lasted for 8 days. He smiled. The fat used to fry them in a symbol
Someday,
of the
maybe
oil.
when you're here.
I'm starved, Allison said with a laugh. When do we try them? Neil glanced toward the door. Just as soon as that sister of mine rolls out of bed, or has Leia decided to sleep until noon? He turned to Benjamin. Benny, why don't you run up and see what's keeping Leia? With a pang, Allison's eyes swerved to David. David's gaze faltered.
Oh.
Allison's face must have altered perceptibly, for even Mrs. Lyman winced. Looking down at Benjamin, she said, I need to gather a few oranges. Come help me, will you? There's a whole bagful on the... Benjamin, she stated quietly but evenly. I need your help. Come along, son.
Oh.
Yes, Mother, but... She drew him away, and they walked out into the courtyard where the sparrows were chirping loudly and flitting from tree to tree. David walked to the open door with his back toward them and stood staring out. Neil, picking up the tension, watched Allison. What is it? He demanded in a low voice. Oh, Neil. Her voice broke. Almost at once, Neil tossed down the spatula and ran into the sitting room on his way to the bedroom as if he must see for himself that Leia was not there. Allison turned and ran after him, but he had already stopped in the sitting room as if putting a brake on his emotions. She's not here, she heard him say in a breath of dismay. No, she whispered. I thought you knew. I thought David had explained. Explained what? I thought she was doubling up with you. Allison looked at him hopelessly. What could she say? What comfort was there to offer? Leia's dead. He didn't move, and for a second she didn't think he had heard her. She nearly repeated herself, but then she saw the pain breaking in his blue eyes. God, he whispered reverently, hoarsely. Why? He sank into the chair, head in hands. She went to him and knelt beside him, her hands on his arm. Tears streamed down her face, more for Neil's pain now than for what could not be changed for Leia. After a few minutes, he said in a cracked voice, How did it happen? Or am I being a fool to ask what I already know how it must have been? We found her at the Roman Syrian digs, the abandoned site near the vacation huts, she explained. They said it was an accident. His eyes came to hers. She knew he understood it was no accident. Pale and tense, Allison waited for him to recover. Does Brett know? Yes, he thinks as we do. Neil, she was murdered by the enemy. The same enemy who killed the man you were to meet at the huts that night, Carl Reuter. How much do you know about all this, Allison? She glanced about the silent room. Is it safe to talk here? Rose is one of us. I thought she might be. When David said he had been corresponding with her about the Zionist movement, The guns and ammunition, are they for friends here in Palestine? She whispered. His hands closed about hers. Not now. Tell me about Leia. About how much you know of this. As much as she trusted him, she felt constrained not to mention the book. She remembered what Leia had said about safeguards being necessary, even when dealing with her own brother. It would be left to Brett as Neil's superior to explain if he chose. Brett, too, had told her to keep silent. I know as much as Leia. She had no one to turn to. I had to help her. I hid her in my hut for 2 days until... She stopped when he groaned. She shouldn't have involved you in this. It's dangerous, as you know by now. So Brett has told me. Well, I am involved, and there's no changing the facts. We'll need to carry on as best we can. She stood and paced as she told him everything that had happened, ending with the attack on the Germans who were following them on the road to Jarablus. They were on Brett's trail, he said. The real Colonel Holman must have arrived from Constantinople. The more you were lucky to get out as you did. David told me about Hamid, but he thinks he'll survive. He stood and walked about the room, but I won't be satisfied until Brett arrives. That motor car is a marked vehicle. The Germans would have wired ahead to every telegraph to have it stopped at all costs. And now he has the guns and ammunition. She swallowed, thinking of the long trek across the wilderness. Tell me more about Leia, he said. What was she doing alone out at the abandoned digs? She left that last night we were together to go meet you. To meet me? He asked incredulously. My orders were to leave the area at once. As soon as our agent was killed, the plans shifted. Brett was to take over. Leia should have known that. We had made plans earlier. If any one of us was trapped, the others were to get out quickly. I thought she had escaped to Damascus. Damascus? She never mentioned it. Are you sure? Of course. We had been waiting to hear from you. Odd, but she seemed to think that she had a reason to expect you to contact her. Did she? Odd, indeed. I can't understand it. We had our orders. What did Major Holden tell you? Nothing. Does he know? About Damascus, I mean? I would think so. He's higher up than either Leia or me. She shook her head. Bewiled. Me.
See what?
She shook her head. Bewiled. Bewildered.
Yeah, well, maybe.
Yeah, bewildered. I don't know. She expected you. It was one of the reasons she didn't leave. One of the reasons. There were more? She looked at him. She had this notion the agent had left behind some message for her. Router. Yes, it was meant for me. I see now. Leia would naturally be obligated to pick up where I left off if something happened. To me, it was in her lap, but I knew Brett was arriving to take my place. I've heard how qualified he was. He had worked in Constantinople before this, then Baghdad, and I thought Leia would have escaped at once to Damascus. Allison sank wearily into a chair. It seems you all crossed purposes, doesn't it? Brett didn't know Leia was there either. If he had, she might be alive today. She looked at Neil across the room, his face drawn and grief in his eyes. Until the very end, she expected you might show up. He groaned. She was ripe for a trap. I don't know a thing about this message, Allison. I'd never had lured.
Spell it.
L-U-R-E-D. Lured.
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 Like he lured her in.
Yeah, with a lure.
Lured.
Lured her away from the hut. Least of all, ask her to meet me alone somewhere with the information. She believed it. She was relaxed and hopeful for the first time since I'd arrived. She kept saying your contact had arrived, that soon the terrible burden would be gone from her. She expected to return with me to Cairo. The contact arrived, all right, said Neil wearily, but not in the way she assumed. Brett came as Colonel Holman. Poor kid. I let her down. No, Neil, how were you to know she was there? Brett, too, only acted on the knowledge he had at the time. No one is to blame, not Leia either. She was brave and dedicated, and she gave her life willingly for the good of England. It's left to us to see she didn't die in vain. He looked at her. I don't like the way you say that. Does Brett approve of your being involved in this? You got to know better than to ask that question. He smiled wanly. You're right, he wouldn't. Well, good. The sooner you're home safe and on Aunt's boat, the happier I'll be. You're all I have left now, now that Leia... He stopped. Ruddy. Development. Why did it have to be Leia? It should have been me. She was filling in for me. Allison went to him. You mustn't blame yourself. You were following orders. From what I've learned, following orders from your superior is absolutely critical. There's little room to branch out on your own, especially risking information out of personal feelings. Oh, Neil, you thought she was safe, and if she died in your place, well, she did it willingly, didn't she? Maybe, but she thought she was meeting me. She trusted me, and I wasn't there. Allison held her cousin, and his body convulsed as he sobbed. Oh, Leia, my poor little sister, left alone out there in the wilderness to face the murderer. Allison led him to the chair and held his sandy head against her until his weeping had ebbed into silence. Minutes passed before either spoke again. When they did, Neil's voice was once again steady, his emotions under control. So that's how they lured her there. They made her think I had arrived. Clever of them. What else did she tell you? Allison looked at him. She was to bring you the information Carl Reuter left for you in his hut. Neil breathed something inaudible. Did she? Allison wavered. How much should she tell him? How much should she leave out? This was her beloved cousin. She trusted him with her life, yet she was to say nothing of the book. She brought a satchel with her. Do you know what happened to it? No, she said truthfully. She was careful. Then they have it, he said wearily. He sank into the chair and lapsed into silence. Maybe not, she wanted to say. That night, said Neil thoughtfully, when she left you at the hut to meet me, what time did she leave? Around 8, I think, when it was very dark. They must have pulled a gun on her and forced her to drive out to the abandoned digs. They took the information and killed her. Allison swallowed, imagining it all. After she left, I heard a noise, like someone had been in Reuter's old hut listening to our goodbyes. Neil walked to the window and, without moving the blind, stared out into the courtyard. It's over now, he said grimly. There's little left to hope for except the safe arrival of Brett Holden. In the grim silence that followed, Allison's concerns swayed back to the safety of Brett. Then David walked in and joined them. I'm sorry, he said, throwing up his hands. I didn't have it in me to tell you about Leia. Anyway, he half grumbled. It seemed best to come from a family member. I hardly knew her. Neil looked over at him. Hardly knew her? I didn't think you knew my sister at all. I didn't say anything, but I met her when she first arrived at the huts. Before the club members came, she had driven down early, she said. She was hostess or something like that. We talked for a while, that's all. Then I left. Allison frowned. But you didn't arrive until the next day, after Major Reuter's death, remember? I met you coming out of the hut. He smiled crookedly. I rather misled you, Allison. I'm sorry. I didn't want you to know the real reason I'd come. I didn't know if I could trust you or not. Well, thank you very much, she said, folding her arms. You know what I mean, he hastened. I'd come to meet Major Holden, and it was to be a secret. Lives were involved, and I didn't want you at risk, so I said he was a professor of archaeology. It seemed fitting, considering the club and all. Little did I know you were already into something even more dangerous than arranging a delivery of guns and ammunition. I began to suspect Leia might be in your hut, and I felt it had something to do with the death of the German officer, but I didn't know what. I had no idea Brett was masquerading as Colonel Holman, until he and some Kurdish soldiers rescued me from that droopy-mustached Mustafa. I'd like to meet up with that guy again. I'd knock his block off. He touched the side of his head, where he had been clobbered. Allison didn't know how much David knew, but it appeared as if he were more involved with Brett Holden than she had thought. Neil seemed to know what she was thinking and said quietly, Our involvement with David is a fork in the road from what's going on at the Berlin-Bagdad Railway. The only thing that's the same is our singular interest in defeating Germany and Austria if war breaks out and spreads to Arabia. The guns and ammunition, she asked. Who are they for? A resistance army? Not exactly. He looked at David. She might as well know, said David. I don't think Major Holden will mind. We're linked with the Zionist movement, with loyalties to Ben-Gurion and others here in Jerusalem and elsewhere. You mean Major Holden? She asked, surprised. Privately, he shares our dreams, but militarily, no. He's not linked except by friendship. He has his own orders. David's brown eyes became serious and intense as he leaned forward in his chair. You know our passion for our homeland. Jews like myself, like Rose, like the others, are willing to fight and die to make a home here in the land God gave us. We want some independence from the Turks, just like the Arabs here do. Rose says a few of the leaders have been arrested by the Turks already. Any public demonstration on our part and the Turks will immediately arrest and imprison us. Rose, Mrs. Lyman, is one of us. A friend of Brett's. It was Brett who told me about her in London when we met at the Zionist meeting that night. Mrs. Lyman has offered to serve the British government as a spy here in Palestine. Should war break out. The guns and ammunition are for our personal protection from the Turks or the Germans, if it comes to that. That little matter we have to thank Major Holden for. He arranged it. Just how? You'll need to ask him. David smiled his enthusiasm. A spy, Mrs. Lyman, said Allison. It was hard to imagine the warm middle-aged Jewish mother as a spy for England. She's not the only one. We've formed a spy ring. Rose is one of the leaders. What better spy than a grandmother's Elise sort who makes good chicken soup, I ask. I think it's wonderful, whispered Allison, moved as always by the sacrifice and courage in others. Yes, who would suspect a middle-aged woman? And of course Leah had done her part, giving her life. Rose is also offering her services in geography, said David. She's an expert on Palestine. She'll aid the British troops mapping out water wells for their use if war comes. The British hope Turkey won't enter on the side of Germany, but they want to be prepared. And you, she asked, you're staying on? I've come as a relative from London with ties to her family in New York. I'll live here, help in any way I can. I expect to involve myself with Ben Gurion and the movement. A movement, Neil said quietly, that will end in tragedy for every Jew if the Turks learn of the political meetings. I've had word this morning that General Pasha has arrived from Constantinople to look into them. Arrests are imminent. The ruddy Turks, said David bitterly. I'll live to see them kicked out of Jerusalem. They are the new cruel taskmasters. They would have us all out making bricks without straw, if they could. I'll admit the truth. I hope Turkey enters the war on Germany's side, and then we'll be at liberty to fight them until we boot them all the way back across the Bosphorus.
This spelled the what?
Bosphorus.
Yeah, there you go.
Bosphorus. You'll forgive me if I don't agree, said Neil. At least about Turkey entering the war. If they side with Germany, we've one long and miserable war ahead of us here in Palestine, Arabia, and Europe. Let it come, insisted David. I'm ready. Allison moved uneasily, thinking of the death and terror that would engulf the world if it came. Yet looking at David and seeing his passion for a Jewish land, she knew she would support the cause if she could. Little Benjamin walked in, and David stood and drew him into his arms with sudden enthusiasm. For his sake, for the children's sake, we must have our own land. We must have a place to live, to be Jews, to worship the Lord God of Israel, and one day, yes, to build our temple like Solomon's temple.
Boy.
It will happen. As sure as there is a sun and a moon in the heavens, God has promised. If the Turks, the Germans, and the Muslims wish to wipe us from the face of the earth, they must first do what, Benjamin? Benjamin looked up at him, his brown eyes gleaming. I can quote it, David. I know it by heart. It is from the book of Psalms. If his sons forsake my law and do not walk in my judgments, if they break my statutes and do not keep my commandments, then I will visit their transgression with the rod, and their iniquity with stripes. Nevertheless, my loving kindness will not utterly take from him, nor allow my faithfulness to fail. My covenant will not break, nor alter the word that has gone out of my lips. Once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever, like the moon, even like the faithful witness in the sky. Psalm 89, said Allison, recognizing the passage. To get rid of Israel, the enemy must first remove the sun and moon from the heavens. They'll never do that, said Benjamin gravely. Allison smiled at him. Not so long as there is a God in heaven, you're right. A faithful God, she thought, touched deeply. And if the Lord is faithful to unfaithful Israel, then he will also be faithful to me, who at times is unfaithful. What a loving Savior, what a God of grace. You're crying, Allison, said Benjamin. How come? David threw his arm around the boy and walked him back toward the dining room. You asked too many questions. Come on, Benny boy. Let's try those latkes. Latkes?
Latkes.
Latkes.
Oh, yeah.
With your mama's preserves. Coming, Allison? Neil? If you don't, I won't promise to save you any. By evening, Brett had not arrived, and their attention grew. Had he escaped from Aleppo? What if the Germans had overtaken him? Anything could have gone wrong. When the morning dawned, the mood in the little house was sober. I still haven't given up, said Neil to the grave faces around the table. Major Holden is no novice. He's survived dangerous times in the past. He's a pro, better than any of us. If it's possible to get through, he will. It's too soon to give up hope. David stood, restless. I'm going out for a while. There's talk of more arrests. I want to see Ben Gurion. Be careful, said Rose. If there are arrests, the slightest trouble would give them more excuse. David laughed shortly. Do you think I aim to take on the Turks single-handedly? I just want to see what I can find out. Be careful, she said again. When David had gone, Rose went to her tiny office to work on her map while Benjamin went out to play with his friends. Allison was alone with Neil. She turned the conversation away from the dark prospects at hand. She could see he hadn't slept well the night before, probably remembering Leia and blaming himself by mulling over all the things he might have done differently. I guess you know dear Aunt Lydia misses you tremendously, Allison began. She would be singing like an English robin if you would come back with me for a visit. Mother and Father have missed you too. A good rest would do you so much good. How is the old dear? He asked of Lydia, still rising at the first light of dawn to minister to the sick. Always. She's quite a woman. I suppose you'll join her on a new voyage down the Nile. It's my intention, but I'm not certain yet. I'll spend time at home with my parents first. They'll be disappointed if I don't. This will be the first time in ages we'll all be together. Mum's dying to speed away back to London with Father. She's wearied to death of Cairo. She'll be a bit disappointed, I'm afraid. What do you mean? He's coming home, you know. He should be back from India when I get there. I hope you'll think of it. I'll hope you'll think about it and come with me. I wish I could, but I can't. There's too much left undone here. And Brett will have my new orders. I don't know if I'll be sent back to the Carchemish Digs now or not. They won't have anything against me since I wasn't on the Durabolis Road. Besides, T.E. Lawrence is still there with Woolley for the British Museum. It will seem quite logical for me to return. I can say I've been away, grieving for my sister. They won't suspect a thing. Maybe not the Germans at the railway, but whoever murdered Reuter and Leia must know you're working as a spy of some sort. You forget. He won't want to hang about either. If they have the information Reuter brought, they'll have accomplished half their purpose. Perhaps they don't have the book, she thought, but she couldn't tell him. Maybe, she said, but even if they do, they won't be satisfied until anyone who may have known something is permanently silenced. That includes you. And Nurse Westcott, he said gravely. Don't forget that. I haven't, but I don't know very much, and I'm going home. As soon as Brett arrived, she wanted to say, but thinking of him only brought concern for his absence. She changed the subject. Why did you say Mum would be disappointed about whisking my father off to England? You know how she's been planning for his retirement from foreign service for the last year. She's even saved money to buy a pleasant cottage in the English countryside with a white picket fence and climbing roses. If anything goes wrong, I don't think she'll stay on, she said quietly. Their marriage is suffering. But I don't envy her. Neil looked at her, his face tired, nor you for that matter. Surprised, she lifted a brow. Why me? He reached over and patted her hand. Because, dear, I have information I've been saving. It's not pleasant where Uncle Marshall is concerned. She became uneasy. You've heard from him? Yes. A wire came just before I left Aleppo, before all the nasty business broke out. It's not going to be pleasant telling your mother he isn't going to be retiring from government service after all. Allison felt the blow as a physical impact. Not retiring. But he was so certain. He promised her. It was a gift for their marriage. I know, because he told me. He shrugged. Well, you know how things are in the world. The Foreign Secretary asked him pointedly if he would stay on for a time because of the uncertainties in Europe, Egypt, and the Suez Canal. Someone steady who knows the Egyptian mindset and the Turks will need to keep a hand on the helm of the state here. She's been packing for the past year, anticipating quitting Egypt, Allison said. I don't know how she'll take the news. You're certain? The telegram is with my things. I'll give it to you later, but by now I'm sure Marshall has wired her, or even gone home to tell her himself, Allison considered. Even if he does, I don't think she'll accept his decision. There's been so much misunderstanding between them recently. I don't think she's in the mood to forgive him about this. She moved uncomfortably. It's no secret that she hates the British life in Egypt. Neil settled back. I'm glad I'm not going to be there when she finds out. His smile faded as he turned thoughtfully, and she had the suspicion he was keeping something more from her. I can't go home yet, Allison. I've some work of my own to do here in Jerusalem, then Carchemish. You're very considerate, she said wryly. I can't wait to be the one to tell Mom her dreams of going home to England have once again been interrupted by the Viceroy of India. It wasn't the Viceroy, it was Kitchener, he said of the British Prime Minister. Oh dear. By lunchtime, David had not returned, and Brett hadn't arrived in Jerusalem. Both Neil and Mrs. Lyman were concerned. Neil suggested he could at least find out what was keeping David. I'm going with you, said Allison. I could use a good walk, and I haven't seen much of Jerusalem in the daylight. The old city was a maze of narrow stone alleys running amid dusty purple shadows. The smell of sun-baked stone permeated the still air of the afternoon. Allison walked beside Neil toward a square where the ancient tower David cast oblong splotches of shadow across the worn rock. Allison looked around, taking in the spiked Muslim minarets, the small cricket houses. Minarets.
Is it?
Minarets.
Yeah.
Minarets.
Muslim minarets, yeah.
The small cricket houses, Jewish shops, and Turkish soldiers. A group of angry Orthodox Jews, all of whom were dressed in black coats, hats, and shoes, were converging on the square, hurling words of rage at the soldiers galloping by on horseback. Allison's eyes widened when she saw the soldiers' sheathed scimitars slung over their left shoulders. Oh my God, say that 5 times fast! There's David, cried Allison. Neil left her by the square as he ran ahead. When Allison caught up, she saw David was scowling. David, are you all right? I am, he said bitterly, but they are not. It's inhumane. It's a transgression against God. David, don't worry. The Turks aren't here because I stirred up a riot. They have raided Jewish leaders' homes and arrested the men. You mean David Ben-Gurion, cried Allison, among others. But why? What have they done?
They arrested David Ben-Gurion?
Done, he shouted above the crowd's noise and the soldiers' shouts. They have done nothing. The newly appointed Turkish military commander of Palestine has arrived in Jerusalem. General Pasha has rounded up 500 Russian immigrant Jews and ordered them to be deported by sea from Jaffa to Egypt. At the harbor, it's reported whole families with their hurriedly collected belongings, old people, mothers, and babies, are being driven onto the boat in wretched disorder. Allison shared his anger. What did they do to deserve such treatment? They're Jews, he snapped, his eyes flashing. Word spread quickly in the crowd of more atrocities by the Turkish general, and the people were shouting, "Murderers!" On General Pasha's way from Constantinople, he had passed through Beirut, Beirut, where he had hanged a number of Jews for being Zionists and Arabs for being leaders of a national movement. This looks bad, warned Neil, looking about. If the Turkish general is here, you can be sure more arrests are coming. Someone had better get back to Rose and warn her and Benjamin. Tell her to hide that map and anything else she may have in the house. That links us with Ben-Gurion's movement. I'll go, said David. But what about you? I'm going to warn Ben Zvi. Zvi. Allison, go with David, will you? Be careful, Neil. He smiled and touched her shoulder, then disappeared into the throng. At the house, the news had already spread to Mrs. Lyman through anxious neighbors. A rabbi had come through the wall into the back courtyard with the warning. His eyes watered and his gray beard shook as he spoke rapidly in Hebrew, gesturing in all directions. David, who spoke Hebrew fluently now and then, filled Allison in on what had happened. During the night, many arrests had been made, Ben Zvi had already been arrested. He and Ben Gurion were members in the local Ottomanization. Ottomanization. I don't know. I'm not gonna. It's not gonna. Committee. They had obtained permission to recruit a Jewish militia to help defend Palestine against Germany and her allies should war come. But that means they're willing to fight on the side of the Ottoman Empire, said Allison. Why arrest them? It doesn't matter, said David impatiently. General Pasha disbanded the militia. He's announced that anyone found with Zionist documents will be put to death. Allison tensed and took a hold of his arm. David, we have to hide you. We have to get you out of here. And Rose and Benjamin? I'm not leaving, came Rose's calm but tight voice. I've run too much and I'm tired. She sank into the chair, and Benjamin drew near, his eyes wide with fear but his mouth tight, as if he was determined not to cry, no matter what. I vowed when I set foot in Jerusalem that I'd never leave, she said. This is our home and we're not leaving. The rabbi wiped his tears as she answered him quietly in Hebrew. David looked at Allison, his expression determined. I'm not leaving either. But you must, she argued. If you stay here, certain death. What good to die for a cause that is sure to be defeated for the moment? Return with me to Cairo. You can work for a homeland from there. No, it's not good. It's no good, said Mrs. Lyman, shaking her head. We'll all take our chances here. They can't prove me a Zionist, nor my son Benjamin. We have papers saying we are British subjects. Major Holden got them for us. But as for you, David, she is right. You must go and come again another day. I will be in touch with you in Cairo. The rabbi was raising his voice, and they turned their full attention on him. After a minute, Mrs. Lyman said, Ben Gurion and Ben Zvi were manacled.
Spell it?
M-A-N-A-C-L-E-D.
Manacled. Manacled.
Yeah, manacled. And put aboard a ship at Jaffa with a note from the governor of the port. What did the note say? Allison asked. Rose's dark eyes were haunted. To be banished forever from the Turkish Empire. The rabbi's face twitched. David threw down his hat in disgust, but it was Benjamin's face that sent a pang through Allison's heart. Bewildered, afraid, haunted. His large brown eyes met hers and stared at her. Allison felt their pain as her own. Banished forever, repeated David. We shall see if the ruddy Turks have the guts to enforce their own edict. May the war come, he breathed, and I pray to God that the Ottoman Empire sides with Germany. I know the men, Ben Gurion and Ben Zvi. They will not crawl away like dogs. We'll rally the Zionists to the side of England and France to help raise troops for a Jewish legion. We'll fight, and if God wills, we will live to see Jerusalem taken from the Turks. The hours dragged by, and Neil did not return, but neither had Turkish soldiers shown up at the house demanding to search or making arrests. As twilight over Jerusalem turned lavender with streaks of silvery blue, they sat in the unlit room waiting. The ominous revel of an approaching vehicle neared the house outside, followed by orders shouted in Turkish and Arabic. Allison stood, as did the others in the room. Quick, hide, she told Benjamin, and David pushed his way to the front door. Allison, get out of here and take Benny with you. She reacted at the command of his voice, grabbing Benjamin and running with him out of the dining room and into the cobbled courtyard. I can't leave her, the boy protested with his first show of tears. I must stay, Allison. I must. I am a Jew. She grabbed his small shoulders and gave him a desperate shake. Your mom will be all right. David will help her. She wouldn't want you taken away. We'll hide and come back later. Do you know of a secret place? All boys do, don't they? We'll go there now, and we'll come back at midnight. Come, Benjamin, do it for me, will you? Please, I'm afraid. In some ways, she said this to win over his boyish pride, but in another way, it was the truth. She was terribly afraid, and her stomach felt nauseous. He rallied like a little soldier, his shoulders straightening. It's all right, Allison. I'll protect you. Come on. Hurry. I know a place they'll never find us. They ran through the darkening courtyard and a side gate that brought them to a narrow cobbled street that was ancient before the time of Rome. With Benjamin leading the way, they darted down the street, keeping close to stone houses and donkey carts. Now and then he would pull her behind one, and they hid when they heard voices. Now what? She whispered when he hesitated. new anxiety over his mother and David coming to his face. "Where do we go from here?" "This way," he whispered, and they ran on until Allison could hardly keep up. They ducked and darted through yards and trees to emerge at last in an Arab bazaar, closing up for the night. The shopkeepers were removing their fruits and vegetables from the stands to bring them indoors. Like the souk at Aleppo, camels, donkeys, and people were everywhere, apparently oblivious to the Turkish arrests of both Jewish and Arab activists. Benjamin must have understood her interest in Jerusalem, for he said proudly, "I'm taking you to where King David fled when his son Absalom led a rebellion against him." She guessed where they were going and was deeply moved by the thought. However, it wasn't King David that she had thought of as he guided her on the way to their hideout. It was another rejected king she remembered and worshipped in her heart as the night deepened and the stars came out white and brilliant above the darkening city. They crossed Brook Kidron and climbed the hill outside the city to the Mount of Olives. Benjamin collapsed under a gnarled olive tree and sat staring toward the city, his mind and heart clearly with his mother and his friends. "They took Ben Gurion away in chains," he said into the starlit darkness. Allison half listened, her hands touching the trunks of ancient olive trees as she walked silently through the grove. Had these gnarled trees been silent witnesses on that late night after the Passover meal when Jesus had prayed to the Father? Was this the ground that had received his tears, his drops of sweat like blood, as he had prepared to become the offering to pay for the sins of the world? "My sin," she thought, overwhelmed with gratitude. "Oh, Lord Jesus, thank you." "They took him away," Benjamin was saying. "He was the only one who would save us from the Turks." Allison looked over at the boy and through her dimmed vision saw that he had finally broken down, weeping unashamedly. She went to him and knelt, her arms going around him. "Oh, Benjamin, the battle for Jerusalem's freedom isn't over. It hasn't truly begun." She soothed his damp hair. "Benjamin, tell me about King David. Tell me the story of how he came here rejected by his people, even though he was their anointed ruler." "His own flesh and blood turned on him," he wept. "They didn't want him to be their king. They chose Absalom instead." When he had finished, she said softly, "There's a story of another king I want to tell you about. He was rejected too. He was from the royal lineage of David. Will you let me?" He looked at her, tears on his cheeks, his soft brown eyes sparkling in the starlight. "Don't interrupt me until I'm finished," she said. "Even if you won't like it at first, let me tell the story." He nodded. "I'm listening." There beneath the old olive trees on the mount, as the stars glinted high in the heavens, and the full pale moon came up behind the Judean hills, Allison told him about that other king and his rejection, of his visit to the mount on the night before his crucifixion. And on the third day he rose again from the dead. Now he sits, King of the kings, at God's right hand. His name is Yeshua?
Yep.
One day he'll return. His feet will stand again on this very mount. Benjamin was silent, and she said no more. For the next few hours they remained in the olive grove, at times talking amiably, and then sitting in silence. The moon began to wane and dip behind the trees. A breeze rustled through the hill grass and nodded the bright heads of the summer poppies. When she believed it safe and the hour late, she stood, dusting off her skirts. "I want you to wait here for me." "Where are you going?" "Back to the house. If it isn't safe, I won't go in. I need to find out what happened. Maybe everything will be all right after all." Maybe Neil's back now, and Major Brett too. Maybe the Turks left. I'll find out. Rest here under the tree. Try to sleep. I'll be back by dawn." "All right, Allison, but if you don't come back..." "I'll come back. She promised. Chapter 12. Allison departed for the long walk back to Jerusalem, but she hadn't gotten far when the approach of rushing footsteps in the darkness startled her. Turkish soldier boys. Soldiers must be searching for the Jews who had fled. She stopped, cringing backwards, heart pounding, debating whether she should turn and flee. But she didn't want to leave them to Benjamin. Then she heard, "It's Allison." The voice belonged to Rose Lyman. Rose? Oh, thank God it's you. You're all right. I have Benjamin. He's safe in the olive grove. Are David and Neil with you? At the sound of their voices, footsteps came running toward them from another direction. Evidently, David had embarked on a secondary trail that led into the mount by way of a cemetery. Allison rushed toward him, her fright ebbing as she realized he was safe. Oh, David, David, I was so worried about you. She embraced him beneath the starlit darkness, but no sooner did she hold him than, like a jolt, she knew it wasn't David. Brett's warm, strong hands enclosed her. She pulled back quickly.
It wasn't David?
No, it wasn't David. It was Brett.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, sorry.
So she hugs him. He hugs her. She pulls back. He goes, "Oh, sorry to disappoint you," came Brett's
right.
soft, low voice. A warm...
See, I don't mind.
Sorry to disappoint you, came Brett's soft, low voice. A warm flush enveloped her as her palms tingled with the feel of the muscle beneath his damp shirt and his returning grasp holding her, if only briefly. With a show of outward poise contrary to her emotions, she turned her head in the direction of Rose, who was hurrying toward them. Benjamin is up there, said Allison, pointing. I'll get him, said Brett, and he climbed the slope. Allison embraced Rose, and for a moment they clung in an unspoken bond. How did you know where to find us? Asked Allison a moment later. Major Holden remembered. Benjamin had told him about his favorite place when Major Brett visited us a month ago. It was then the Major gave me the papers. Thank God. She lifted her eyes toward the heavens. These papers saved us tonight, Benjamin and me. What papers? Asked Allison, interested at once. Papers saying we are Turkish citizens. Imagine, they look so official, not even the Turkish colonel could tell the difference. Me, Turkish, she laughed, but it bordered on hysteria. Allison swiftly grabbed her shoulders and gave her a little shake. It's all right now. We're safe. It worked. Yes, it worked, and I've the Major to thank. Here they come. Benny, thank God. She rushed toward the boy and clasped him in a bear hug to her heart. My boy, my poor brave boy, you're all right? Brett walked up to Allison, and in the starlight she could see no trace of a smile. You can't do anything more here. We need to get out while we can. The Turks are still rounding up suspected Zionists. I can't leave now, Major. What of Rhodes? Of Benjamin? His gaze flickered. Involved emotionally already. First espionage, now a Jewish homeland. You'll soon find the world's sorrows enough to break any heart. Better stick with delivering babies. At least you have something to show for all your sweat and tears. Come, we're taking the railway this time. Allison pulled back and Brett stopped. As he briefly looked at her face, he smiled. Go ahead and say it. You're arrogant, sir. How dare you tell me what to do, how to feel? It's my heart. And so it is. But if you wish to invest your ideals in anything in the future, you would be wise to cooperate with me now. Unless you want to stay and answer General Pasha's questions. He has no qualms about arresting women spies and torturing them into telling all. You're frightening me on purpose. Oh yes, I am a heartless cynic. Are you, Major? She asked suddenly and met his eyes evenly, searching his face. As she did, Rose came up with Benjamin and reached a hand to grasp hers. Thank you, Allison. Major is right. You can do nothing more here. We'll be all right now. We have a way of surviving the worst. Won't you come with me to Cairo? It's so dangerous here for you. Yes, but we have a cause. One that will not die, no matter what they do to us. If something happens to us, then others will grow like new plants from where we fall. Israel must live, and to end the struggle, the tears, the pain, will be worth it. If not for us, then for another generation. We lay the foundation, and others will build. I cannot leave. With the Turkish papers, Benjamin and I at least have a chance. That is more than many others have. Allison looked at Benjamin, and his gaze dropped. She smiled. Goodbye, Benny. I'll see you again one day. Take care of your mother, and thanks for showing me your secret hideout. Brett had walked ahead, and Allison turned from Rose to Benjamin to follow him. She had gone a few feet when Benjamin called quietly, Allison. She stopped and looked back, seeing two darkened figures holding each other below the Mount of Olives. Yes? I liked the story you told me. I liked it a lot. Her eyes moistened and she smiled faintly, then lifted her hand in a goodbye gesture. Brett was far ahead, waiting as though he knew she would come. Pain from blister on her foot had set in, a consequence of the ill-fitting shoes she had worn in the flight from the city. She tried not to limp, not wishing him to notice. She was dusty and bed-raggled, too, with several strands of hair loose and her dress soiled and stained with perspiration. She didn't think he noticed, but she was wrong. He paused. "I'll carry you. You've been through enough." She didn't know why, but the idea alarmed her. She wanted to stay as far removed from Brett Holden as she possibly could. Had David or Neil made the offer, she would have accepted gratefully. But Brett was an emotional risk. That isn't necessary, Major," she said distantly. "I'm quite all right. Thank you just the same." "Very self-sufficient and all that," he said. "Very commendable of you, nurse." She tossed him a glare. Brett smiled and slowed his stride so she could keep up. "You don't belong out here, you know. You're like a water lily in a rock garden." She shrugged, looking ahead. "I don't think so." "No, that's just my imagination then." She limped along, furious with herself. Why wouldn't she simply allow him to carry her without making an issue of it? It was too late now. She had already alerted him that she was too aware of Major Brett Holden. "You're afraid to have me carry you." "Absurd. Why should I be?" Kind of question. "I simply wish to walk on my own, that's all." Her face felt hot. "I admire your unfaltering courage, the spirit of the dedicated young nurse shining through with all its attractive nobility." She gave a laugh. "You don't think that. You think I'm a nuisance, and the sooner you get me off your hands, the more relieved you'll be."
Yeah.
"Relieved, yes, but happier, debatable. I rather like lilies, especially when my parched soul is sick to death of the desert. But your noble spirit can prove a problem." "Do you have something against women with, as you say, a noble spirit?" she asked defensively. "I haven't found many." Allison laughed. It was, despite herself, a rueful laugh. "I suspect there is a reason for your being such a cynic. I suspect you have known one too many women." Brett's smile was brief. "Guilty without a shred of evidence. I'm disappointed in you after all. Admit it. You know absolutely nothing about me, and yet you rush to assume the worst. Now why, dear Lily, would you do that?" "You're right, Major. I don't know your past, but I know you. Any rush to judgment isn't because I'm attracted to you and avoiding the unpleasant discovery." "Perish the thought," he said smoothly. "It would never do, would it? Rest assured, nurse, that it never entered my mind." He looked at her with curious intent. "So you do have faults beneath that demeanor. I'm curious." "You have your protective armor all in place, and you've drawn your sword against me before I've even thrown down the gauntlet." "Gauntlet?" He smiled faintly. "When a knight wishes to duel an opponent for a lady, he throws down his gauntlet. You're a bit overprotective, aren't you? Your emotions are very safe, since I haven't said yet that I wish to take on Wade Finley." She looked at him, but fell off in conclusion when his disarming smile called a truce. Was he serious? Despite herself, she smiled in return. "Major, I am sorry. You're right. I'm being rather silly and defensive, aren't I?" "I'll forgive you, considering what you've been through recently." "Thank you for your charity, Major. Somehow, I didn't think it was one of your characteristics." "Back to that again. Of course, you're probably wondering why I've told you I've avowed no intention of awakening the emotions of such a noble-spirited young woman." She drew in a breath, but kept her eyes ahead. Of all the nerve. "I do not wonder. It never entered my mind." "I'm sure it has. Even if you won't admit it, a proper girl wouldn't admit it, of course. So I'll tell you. I assure you, Major Holden, I am not in the least interested in your reasonings. One reason is that, when I do find an obvious charmer such as yourself, with a noble tilt to her chin and a gleam of sacrifice and duty in her eye, it's rather disturbing to what you so bluntly call my cynical outlook." "I gather I should be flattered Okay, hold a sec. I gather I should be flattered that I'm one of the few you have classified as noble. You're anything but typical, but then the others never held the much interest for me. Maybe it's just as well you haven't thrown down the gauntlet, since neither Wade or I would accept the challenge." "A disappointment. But if I ever decide to challenge that too glib refusal, I'll play fair and warn you first." "Warn me?" "Yes, that I intend to win, regardless. Until then, you can relax in my presence. Romance is the last thing on my mind, with Germans and Turks on my trail. Oh, I'm so glad you've told me. For a dreadful moment, I thought otherwise. I feared that I might end up breaking your hard and conceited heart, and I should hate to have it on my conscience. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing faintly, and laughed. But it wasn't unpleasant. The lily has thorns. Then again, he went on, you are rather young. I would say 18 or 19. Impossible. Infuriating. A woman never tells her age. I can find out easily enough when I'm ready. You could use some growing up before I would seriously entertain any notion of barging into your idealistic world. She was too angry to answer. And, he said softly, I haven't the heart to shatter your noble spirit. It becomes you. Unfortunately, there are other dangers besides romance. It's reckless of you, not to mention dangerous, to intrude into espionage and the struggle for Zionism. Her heart felt as if a rock had fallen into its cavern. Thank you, she said stiffly. I shall keep your words in mind, Major. If we are each to be on guard with our emotions, we shall fare well enough. But you needn't concern yourself with my losing the idealism you seem to think I have. I have no intentions of doing so, since what I believe has a firm foundation far removed from any human loftiness. Christianity is quite up to equipping me to face the ugliness of the world and the dangers of getting my angelic wings singed. He stopped, hands on hips, and tilted his head. It's like a slight smirk showed in the moonlight. With determination, he swung her up into his arms and strode onward. Allison settled into meek silence, trying to think of everything but his arms around her. He walked in silence until they came to where he had parked the vehicle, hidden behind a myrtle tree. He set her down, and she leaned against the dusty car, removing her shoe. Be careful, he said. There are scorpions. I know all about it, Major. She tossed her shoes into the back of the car. Where are David and Neil? She looked about, her throat dry. I thought they were waiting for us. She stopped, her eyes swerving to his. The wind came against them, and she looked into his inscrutable face. For a moment, she couldn't speak. A new uncertainty was rising painfully in her heart and squeezing out her ability to breathe. Brett sighed and sank back against the tree, her suspicions settling into a dread certainty. Neither you nor Rose mentioned them, she said in a low voice. But I was sure. He straightened, took her arm, and opened the door. There was a gentleness both in his touch and voice, quiet and deliberately calm. You've had a trying day, haven't you? Are you up to a bit more? Where are they? She asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Are they waiting somewhere else for us? No. She clasped her arms about herself and fought the tears that wanted to erupt. Why not? She half accused, as though he were to blame. What have you done with them? My dear, I haven't done anything with them. Why should I want to? He let out a breath. They've been arrested. I haven't been able to do anything about it yet. I can try when we get to Cairo, but there's nothing I can do here now. If I try, they'll be on me like a hornet's nest. I once met General Pasha in Constantinople. He knows who I am, and by now he knows I walked in the German boots of Colonel Holman. Allison wanted to vent her anguish, but his sudden grip on her hands, squeezing his sympathy and understanding, shot a bolt of strength through her. She swallowed hard. That a girl, Allison. You've got what it takes. No, she half sobbed. I don't. You don't think I do? He held her tightly. You're wrong. She pushed away. The wind rippled the leaves of the myrtle tree, and the branches creaked. The moon had gone down, and the darkness held them alone in a desolate wilderness. I'll do what I can in Cairo, he whispered firmly. The best thing I can do now for us all is to avoid getting caught. She hardly heard him above the painful cry of her heart. She wouldn't envision what Neil and David might be going through at the hands of the Turks. If she did, she might scream. Despite her good intentions, she choked on a sob. I didn't want to tell you, he said. Try not to think about it. There's nothing you can do to change things, nor can I, not now. That's easy for you to say. That's where you're wrong. It's miserably difficult for me. They are both friends of mine, and I don't ever find it easy. Especially now. With you? He stopped. Allison looked at him. I'm getting you back to Egypt, he said gruffly. Allison got in. Well, Allison got in, and he drove without speaking. She felt mercifully dull. Reaching under the seat, he handed her a canteen and a bag. "Life goes on," he said rather irritably, "and I'm hungry and thirsty. There's bread and meat in the bag. Fix me a sandwich, will you?" She did so, her hands feeling heavy and slow. He ate, but she could not. Instead, she unstopped the canteen and drank, expecting water. The delicious hot coffee was a welcome. Brett watched the road ahead. "We'll board a steamer to Port Said from Jaffa. Should the Turks ask about us, we need to get our story straight. We're married." Allison looked at her soiled dress and her bare feet with a blister. She looked at her wind-blown hair. A fine marriage, she thought, ironically, and then she laughed harshly. Brett smiled dryly, but his eyes reflected sympathetic patience. "Hand me the coffee, Mrs. Holden." They had left behind Neil and David, Rose Lyman, and Benjamin in the thick of a political and religious storm. Brett had promised her he would do all he could at Cairo intelligence to get Neil and David out of Turkish imprisonment. As for Rose and the movement for the Jewish homeland, those involved would always risk the threat of death. Rose would never abandon the cause for safety. What about David? The Arabian desert, Aleppo, the Hittite archaeological site near Jarablus were also left behind, along with the lonely grave of cousin Leia and the book that held the key to the information so important to Brett and Cairo intelligence. Where was it? In the hands of the enemy? Brett didn't think so, and she probably agreed. Had Leia hidden it? Where? The answer really isn't that hard. It all waited for a future hour of discovery. The motor car rolled toward Jaffa, where David Ben-Gurion had been expelled from Jerusalem in chains. In a few days, she would arrive in Port Said to the safety of her family in the comfortable white house and her spacious blue and white bedroom. A sweet bath, her wardrobe, and days of sleep in a soft feather bed would be waiting. She nearly sighed aloud, thinking of it. She looked over at Brett when he didn't notice and studied the handsome masculine lines of his face as he rested his head in one hand, his elbow propped against the car door, the other strong hand on the steering wheel. As she studied him, she wondered if she really was sorry the British major was going to be stationed in Cairo. She shut her eyes with determination and found herself thinking it would be better, she was not sure for whom, if Brett was transferred to some other post. Her father, she thought, could possibly arrange it. Thinking of her father brought the disturbing news to mind that had been shared with her by her cousin Neil at Mrs. Lyman's house. Her father would not be retiring from his post as her mother had expected. There would be more family discord, more trouble between them. She was helpless to know what to do about it. And if matters came to the worst and her mother bought passage home to England, she would naturally wish Allison to go with her. With Leia's death, Allison's mother would be even more adamant that the dangers of Arabia and Cairo posed too great a threat for her daughter, and now Neil was imprisoned. Allison thought that Brett would likely be the military official who would inform her parents of Neil's captivity, and she, of course, would need to be there. If the threat of war with Germany loomed as dark as Brett seemed to think, her mother would make plans to voyage to England before the dangers of torpedoes threatened civilian ships. How could she tell her mother that she was considering staying behind to serve the British and Australian soldiers as a military hospital nurse? Suddenly that thought seemed quite possible and even compelling. How could she leave when Leia had given her life, when women like Rose Lyman stayed on in the threat of imprisonment and torture, and David? Even now he was under the ruthless hand of the Turkish general. But her mother would never understand all this. She would insist her daughter return to civilized England. Allison had much to explain when she returned home. She looked again at Brett. He could help her explain if he decided to, but would he want her to stay and journey to England and out of his life? That's the end of part 2.
Yeah.
Start here.
Oh, and I looked at your whole car. It all looks like brand new except that one spot.
Part 3, Egypt, Chapter 13. The Sinai, S-I-N,
Sinai.
Sinai, The great and terrible wilderness, home of the Israelites for 40 years after the exodus from Egypt, lay inland like a triangular thumb from the northern coastline of the Mediterranean. The inland plain of Sinai was marked by shifting dunes that became the forbidding gravel and limestone plateau, marking the beginning of the Alti, the wandering. But as Allison arrived with Brett from Jaffa at El Arish, on the coast between Turkish-controlled Gaza and Egypt's Port Said, the beaches of El Arish were blue and warm. The tiny waves washed over the white sand. Further inland, the Bedouins were gathering on this particular Wednesday for their souk, the open-aired market. Allison was accosted by the familiar smells of camels and goats and bartered goods ranging from animals to rugs. Cheese, cloth, jewelry, flour, tea, and rifles were spread out in the bazaar. She noticed Brett speaking to one of the leaders who had several carbines, and she remembered the ammunition and guns brought into Jerusalem. What had Brett done with them? Were they to have been delivered to David Ben-Gurion and the Zionists? The Bedouins were a familiar sight to Allison. Dressed to withstand the burning rays of the desert heat, the men wore flowing robes that allowed a cooling breeze. As a nurse, she knew the robe. Lessened moisture loss in the hot, dry wind, thus helping them avoid heat stroke. A cloth wound around their heads shielded their faces from sun and blowing sand. The women were dressed in black. At first she had thought the color forced on them by their Muslim religion was unfair, since black heats up faster than white. Yeah. But the outer clothing worn over dress-like garments of flowing material that was surprisingly cool. Their head coverings were embroidered with a tiny cross stitch design in blue for unmarried and red for married. A veil was worn with the same colored stitches, and she saw many that were decorated with coins and sea-based shells. The coins reminded her of the women in the Lord's parable who had lit a lamp and swept her house as she searched diligently until she found her lost coins. Am I as diligent in seeking the spiritual welfare of the lost? She asked herself. Do I care for these Bedouin tribes, or am I content to leave them lost within their Muslim beliefs, telling myself I have no right to disturb their culture? What lie of Satan is this that entire people should be left? I can't read all that over there. Ooh. Should be left to the fatalistic helplessness of Islam. The gospel is not cultural, she thought, nor does truth destroy what is good in any culture. Why couldn't the scriptures be translated into their languages so they could know the truth, yet retain their culture undisturbed by British influence? The Bedouins were lovers of hospitality, and their tents were always open to receive visitors. Brett insisted they accept the hospitality of a certain Bedouin leader. But Allison was skeptical. Why are you so interested? She whispered as they followed him. What makes you think I am? Because we didn't need to stop at El Arish. You might have gone straight on to Port Said, since there's little here except lovely beaches and the Bedouins. I gather you have a particular reason for coming, especially when we are both anxious to arrive in Cairo. Very observant. Remind me never to underestimate your powers of deduction. Thank you, Major, she said airily. I suppose that's as close as I'll come to receiving a true compliment from you. I suspect, Miss Westcott, men pay you too many compliments, and so you've come to expect them. He had avoided answering her question about his interest in El Arish. She looked at him. His dark blue eyes hinted at amused tolerance. Wrinkled, she breathed. No need to bother, Major. I doubt if you know how to pay the kind of compliments a woman would find flattering. Not so. But I first have to consider the consequences. Allison pretended indifference and marched along beside him toward the Bedouin tent. It was constructed of goat and camel hair panels that the women had woven and then stitched together. I've heard that Bedouin women put English women to shame when it comes to submission and hard work, he said. She ignored his deliberately baiting tone. Men are their masters, he said. Necessarily so, of course. Allison walked along, refusing to look at him. When the Bedouin moves, he went on, it's the wife who's in charge of taking down the tent. She secures it on the family camel and reassembles it at the new site. She can roll up its sides to let in the pleasant desert breezes, or stake it down to secure it in the sand. If there's a divorce, she's permitted to keep the tent while hubby takes all the domestic animals and leaves. In search of a new woman able to work a trifle harder, no doubt, she said. Maybe she didn't have the muscles to grind his flour fine, so he had to endure lumps in his bread. Interesting observation. I always did think muscles should be fairly high on the list of proprieties when a man shops for a bride. She glanced at him. He smiled and gestured to the tent. As for my reason in coming here, maybe it's as simple as wanting what the man offered. To the Bedouin, hospitality is mandatory. Guests are welcome to stay for 3 days and 3 nights. I hope you don't intend to accept all that is mandatory, Major. He smiled. In exchange for tea or coffee, the male host expects long and friendly conversation. He keeps informed of news in the population centers that way. Is that why you've come? To give or acquire news? Always suspicious. I'm believing to think everything you do is for British espionage, even sharing a cup of coffee with a friendly Bedouin. Not everything. Outside the tent they paused as the Bedouin spoke to his wife and daughter. Maybe you wish to gather information for your own interests, she whispered. Won't you be bothered by my presence? I too shall hear everything since I know a little Arabic. Brett smiled. No, I've arranged for you to have tea behind that veiled partisan in the company of women. You have it all figured out, don't you? You don't want me to hear.
Behind that veiled
partition. You have it all figured out, don't you? You don't want me to hear. I could have left you wandering to suck, but you know the Muslim mind. A woman alone wearing Western clothing and with hair undone would be misunderstood. Allison suspected Brett was interested in El Arish because of its desert location near Gaza and Beersheba. Should war break out, it was a likely spot for British troops, but what the Bedouin might know or could offer remained guarded by Brett. The orange sun was low in the blue sky when they left the Bedouin tents and boarded the El Arish steamer for Port Said. Standing on deck with Brett, she rested against the rail while enjoying the Mediterranean breeze. Are you interested in El Arish for a military camp? She asked. Don't you think you know enough to keep you in trouble for a while? A polite way of reminding me to mind my own business. For good cause. I wouldn't want Wade Finley to arrive from Oswald Chambers Bible Training College and find I'd co-signed his fiancée to the same fate as Leia. Consigned. Mention of Leia ended her brighter mood at being on the blue water with the warm wind. She grew sober as the glowing globe of the Egyptian sun set an orange and crimson splash over the desert horizon. She admired his profile as they stood in the warm twilight, and he turned and gazed and caught her gaze. She flushed, afraid he had noticed. Did anyone ever tell you your eyes are as pale green as warm sea water? She laughed to cover her fluster. So you do compliment women after all, Major Holden. And with a breeze in your auburn hair, you're breathtakingly lovely. She looked away, the heat coming up her neck to her cheeks. You didn't comment when I said you were Wade Finley's fiancé. She wrapped her palms around the rail, watching the Mediterranean. I didn't consider it a question. My statement was meant to give you an opportunity to set the record straight. Yes, I gather that it was. You haven't satisfied my curiosity. He reached over and unloosed her left hand from the rail, holding it up for inspection. A brow lifted curiously. I don't see an engagement ring. She pulled away her hand. Bible students aren't known for having an income. Her voice was steady. Does your evasive answer mean you're not actually engaged to him? Allison pushed her hair from her eyes and avoided his gaze, enjoying the cooling breeze against her warm skin. I suppose you could say we're engaged. Perhaps we assume more than we've openly agreed to. You don't sound very excited about the prospect. She looked at him, a little startled. Then, as a mild rebuke, she said, I don't think a sound and good relationship needs to be based on breathless infatuations, Major Holden. There is so much more in marriage to contemplate besides romance. Granted, much more, including shared spiritual values, which I assume you have with him, and Friendship. You could be left in isolation by the strong silent type. You strike me as a woman who would want long conversations to pour out your heart while he listens, understands, and offers more than quick answers to resolve what's bothering you. His insight was disturbing. Allison looked away. She thought of the long discourse she had had with him that night in the expedition hut while they waited for David's arrival. Safeguarding her vulnerability, she said easily, Oh, Wade Finley and I are quite close in our interests. I've missed him terribly. Brett smiled wryly and folded his arms. Is that why you've been carrying his unopened letter for days? Confronted by his challenge, she hastened to explain. You may assume too much by that. I could, but do I? The right moment to open and read. It hasn't arrived because it demands my full attention. Anyway, how did you know about the letter? It was in your kit bag, he said evenly. She turned to face him, growing indignant. You looked in my kit bag? Yes, all on the up and up, of course. Strictly business. You didn't expect an agent not to at least suspect Leia planting Woolie's book in your bag, did you? The book. She stopped. She hadn't even considered the possibility. Her eyes narrowed. And were you satisfied, Major, that I haven't carried it away in secret beneath your very nose? Come, Allison, don't look so indignant. I apologize, but I couldn't take any chances. You might have simply asked me to open it so we could both find out, she countered stiffly. I could have, but that would have permit you to know as well, and I wasn't sure if you were keeping it from me deliberately. You still think I could be a spy for the other side? With limpid green hair and auburn... Oh. With limpid green eyes and auburn hair, you'd make a potent opponent. I'm glad to discover you're as innocent of espionage as you are of romance with Wade Finley. That's not what I said. Brett leaned against the rail, watching her. Well, you will soon have all the proper time to indulge in his love letter. You can lock your bedroom drawer and swoon all over the page. I don't swoon, she corrected. Anyway, Wade isn't that sort of letter writer. He would have better things to say than that he is lovesick, and he would tell me what is happening. He would tell me about what is happening in the college and about his plans to come to Cairo as chaplain with the military. All commendable, but why is it, Miss Westcott, he mused, that I think you too easily scorn the idea of knowing or appreciating the depth of love? That isn't true, she choked. I do know. There was someone... She stopped abruptly, catching herself. He became alert, but she quickly turned away her head, holding the rail too tightly. He was quiet for a long minute, and she bit her lip, angry with herself for allowing Neville's memory to surface. I see I was wrong, he said, and turned away to look out to the darkening sea. She remained silent, allowing the wind to blow against her, easing the pain in her heart. I gather it wasn't Wade Finley, he said. No, but I don't wish to discuss the past, Major. It is Wade now, and there's nothing more to be said. I think there's a great deal more to be said, but you're right. No, this is not the time, and I understand why. She gave him a side glance, expecting to see the pain of some past love relationship reflected on his face. She might have known a man of his qualities would have had a number of women interested in him, but had he cared about any of them? In studying him, she found his expression inscrutable. He, too, took emotional solace behind a facade of armor, and she wondered what it might be like to lure him out. No, Brett Holden, above all men, must be the one to stay away from romantically. The next day, just after 5 o'clock, the steamer docked in Port Said, a curious city of both ancient and modern Egypt that was the northern gateway to the Suez Canal. Many streets were lined with buildings dating back to the previous century, and people who had traveled in America said the structure's pillared porch facades resembled the French Vaux quarter of New Orleans. I don't know how to pronounce that. Don't judge me.
Alice, what kind of quarter?
Quarter of New Orleans. Allison's family had a home here as well as in Cairo, but Lady Westcott preferred Port Said with its British influence, although she spent half the year in residency in Cairo. The Mediterranean beaches facing the houses with their wrought iron and terraces offered pleasant breezes and a view of the passing ships that was quite unlike Cairo's Muslim Egyptian atmosphere. Port Said's main street ran along the beach, and a second ran along the canal docks where Allison and Brett disembarked from the steamer. Brett held a small lift to carry them to the Westcott house. The sun was low in the sky, and its fading rays turned Port Said waters to rose pink and amber. The Mediterranean swelled with waves, and pomegranate and sycamore trees grew along the streets near the house. In the front yard were several lush banana trees, which were first believed to have entered Egypt during the time of the Crusades. These particular trees flourished under the devoted care of Lady Westcott's gardener, Ayub. Allison's steps quickened along the walk toward the front terrace porch, past green ornamentals of Persian lilacs and Jaraconda, Jacaranda,
Okay.
Jaraconda, coral, and flame trees. While Brett lingered just inside the door, Allison entered the front hall and called cheerfully, "Mother, I'm home. We've a guest." Lady Eleanor Bristow Westcott was 37, but could easily pass for much younger. According to the standards of her day,
37's old.
According to the standards of her day, her life was all but lived, and in her own troubled mind she had wasted what little there was of it as the wife of a consul general of British Egypt. She made no apology for disliking the culture, nor did she feel it welcomed her, a true daughter of England. For that matter, she believed the man she had married neither loved her nor cared a whit about her needs. Sir Marshal Westcott was married to the British government. She was merely the mother of his 2 living children, Allison, who was the eldest, and Beth, who at 15 had long been in need of schooling and a social life in England. Eleanor opted to live in Port Said for as much of the year as she could. There her view of the Mediterranean and the ships coming and going fed her imaginings of escape from Egypt. In Cairo she rarely ventured out to shop in the bazaar, for, as she explained to Sir Westcott, I'm ruthlessly pummeled by dirt, noise, and the chaos of the streets. Dreariness is everywhere, and flies. Cairo's foreign flavor made Eleanor feel dislocated and alone. I regret I ever came here. Why can't people speak in conversational tones rather than shout everything as though people are deaf? Eleanor felt vulnerable. She didn't belong to the British Foreign Service, and she never would, despite having endured Marshal's calling for 10 years. Before Egypt, it had been Bombay. She hadn't felt at home in India either, but she had managed to cope much better with the British of the East India Company than she had managed in Cairo. There were the wives of the other British officials, of course, and General Rex Blaine and dear Sarah. What would she have done without Sarah? But there were few others, and none of them was an intimate friend in whom she could share her marital frustrations when Sir Westcott was away, sometimes for months. Lady Westcott had shared all these thoughts with her daughter, Allison, but it hadn't seemed to assuage Lady Westcott's pain. She had expressed immense relief when her husband had agreed to resign at Christmas or as soon as his replacement arrived. He said he was willing to spend the rest of his years in the England country cottage she had put money down on, and he had promised to do some of the things she seemed to think were important. Now the coming war was about to change all that. Allison wondered how her mother would respond to the disturbing news from her husband. Chapter 14. The rich mahogany of the polished hardwood floor sounded under Allison's steps as she walked through the entrance hall, kept cool and shaded by the drawn inner wooden shutters on the windows. Light streamed through the double French doors leading into the large sitting room that faced the garden. She crossed the hall floor to the doorway and stood there glancing about for her mother, who was usually out in the garden this time of evening. Her senses were embraced by the comfort that came to her in seeing the familiar sofas, chairs, and ottomans, which were upholstered in ivory brocade and embroidered with small blue-gray leaves. The fabric matched the thick drapes that had been drawn back to allow the coolness from the garden to drift in along with the familiar fragrance of her mother's Persian lilacs. Allison saw her then, walking up the garden path. For a moment, Allison was transported back to England, to a time of great ladies, of elegance, of graciousness. Lady Eleanor Bristow Westcott was carrying lilacs, and her soft gray satin dress set off her reddish gold hair to perfection. A few lines were on the supple skin, and her delicate brows arched with womanly grace above eyes a lighter green than her daughter Allison's. Eleanor saw her and paused with brief surprise, and then smiled. Setting the lilacs down on a wrought iron table, she came up to the terrace steps into the sitting room. "Allison, darling, I was so afraid." Allison rushed toward her across the room. "Mother, I'm dreadfully sorry. I should have sent a wire saying I was all right. Have the Blaines been here?" Eleanor embraced her tightly. "They were here last night for a small dinner party. Sarah said you had simply vanished in Aleppo. Imagine my horror when at the same time you disappeared. Sarah informs me Leah died and Neil disappeared. I feared something quite dreadful had happened to you as well. Where on earth have you—" Her words were left hanging in mid-air when her eyes went past Allison to Major Brett Holden. Yeah. Brett stood in silence near the sitting room doorway. Allison saw her mother study him cautiously. This is Major Brett Holden," said Allison in a rushed voice, hastening to add when her mother's brow arched with a delicate suspicion. "He's been transferred from Constantinople to the Cairo intelligence office." "Oh, indeed. Intelligence, you say?" Allison relaxed a little as she read the swift approval stealing into the place of suspicion. She could understand her mother's concerns. Allison had disappeared and then shown up in the company of an exceptionally good-looking British major. "I can explain everything," began Allison. Then she heard Brett's polite voice saying, "I've escorted your daughter home from the Archaeological Club, Lady Westcott. There was a bit of trouble, as you must already know if General Blaine informed you about your niece, Leah Bristow." "Yes."
"Okay, Blaine is the bad."
"Yes, he explained her death," she said quietly. "A dreadful accident. I understand the Turkish authorities are still looking into the matter, and the British consul as well. Please, won't you come in and sit down, Major? I'll have Zelika bring some refreshment." With concealed amusement, Allison watched Brett suavely step in and take over explaining all that had happened. She noticed that he avoided any mention that his service in Cairo intelligence stemmed from his previous activities in espionage. His work in Cairo, he explained, would involve various military aspects, some of which would take him back to Baghdad and perhaps Constantinople as well. Since he had some family in Cairo, he was satisfied to have been transferred to Egypt. Allison wondered why he hadn't told her earlier that he had family in Cairo, but that thought was swiftly eclipsed by another startling remark made by her mother. "Oh, so that is where I heard your name. Lady Walsh mentioned it only last Sunday after church service. She said her niece Cynthia had arrived from England. Lady Walsh's niece is your fiancée, I gather." Allison didn't move. Brett's composure had not cracked as he said, "Then Cynthia's here. I had begun to be concerned. She was to have arrived last month." Allison was careful to keep her expression bland and reached for her teacup, but much to her dismay, she set it on the saucer. "I'm sorry, what a mess I'm making." "Zelika," her mother called calmly for the serving woman, and Allison stood, for she had splashed some on her skirt. Brett Holden mopped off the tea with a napkin.
"Oh, he mopped it off his clothes."
Her clothes. She splashed it on her skirt.
"Oh, my."
Improper. She hoped he wouldn't mistake the spilled tea for a reaction to mention of Cynthia. "It's all right, Major," she said tonelessly, plucking the napkin from his hand. "My dress was rather soiled anyway after travel." As he straightened, their eyes met, and Allison's irritation grew when she felt warmth flare up in her cheeks and saw a touch of a smile on his mouth. Zuleika came unobtrusively to replace Allison's cup with a fresh one. Brett steered the conversation back to Carchemish, and while not coming out and agreeing with the Blaines that Leia's death had been an accident, he made no effort to contradict that report. By the time he had finished, Allison was quite certain her mother was convinced Major Brett Holden was a fine and gallant British officer intent on little more than honorably filling out his military term in Egypt, marrying Cynthia Walsh, and returning to a quiet and civilized life in England. Allison was not as certain, at least about his future. He had made no earlier mention of wishing to return to England any time soon. Not that his silence on the matter proved anything. She realized she knew little about his ambitions, and that they had shared little except the danger they had experienced together. Why would she be disturbed by the mention of some young woman named Cynthia? Was a matter deserving more thought later, when Allison was alone and free to contemplate the meaning. She realized her mother was looking at her and speaking. Allison quickly turned her attention to what Lady Westcott was saying, aware that Brett was watching both mother and daughter with restrained thoughtfulness. "General Blaine informed me you had left the archaeology huts at Aleppo at the same time the young Jewish activist David Goldstein also disappeared. You mentioned David to me several times, but I must say I was surprised to hear he had left England to come here. Does he have an interest in archaeology as well? Is that what brought him to the club meeting?" It was time to tell her mother the dark news of his arrest and of her nephew's, since the Blaines had not known what happened after Leia's death and Allison's own disappearance with David.
Okay,
"David is a Zionist," says Allison. "I told you about their desire to establish a Jewish homeland. He came to Aleppo to bring me a letter from Wade Finley, and..." She hesitated, wondering if she should mention Brett and how he and David were friends. Again, Brett came easily and smoothly to her aid, informing her mother of David's arrest by the Turks. "Unfortunately, Lady Westcott, I've some unpleasant news for you. Your nephew, Neil Bristow, was with David and is also being held for questioning. Once in Cairo, I expect to do all I can to see both men released. I've no doubt Neil will leave Jerusalem, and he will probably come here to see you. I'm not as certain about David. His heart is in Jerusalem, and he'll likely stay there if he's not expelled." "Expelled? That's rather despicable of the Turks, but likely," said Eleanor. "I read just this morning in the Cairo paper of the arrival of more than 500 Jews whom General Pasha expelled from Palestine. Something ought to be done about it by the European governments. It seems to me the Jews have as much right to live in Jerusalem as the Arabs and the Turks, perhaps more, since God gave that land to the Jewish patriarchs. And this is troubling news about my nephew." She looked at Brett curiously. What was Neil doing in Jerusalem instead of the Carchemish digs? "I wasn't able to see Neil. He was arrested along with David before I arrived." Allison wasn't sure if her mother noticed Brett avoided a question. It might have had something to do with the British Museum, her mother offered. "Neil's work has taken him to various ancient cities and archaeological sites, but the Turks will need to release him," she said firmly. "I'll speak to Marshal when he arrives. As Consul General of Egypt, his influence may help." She looked alert and showed more interest in national affairs than Allison remembered. "Don't you think, Major, the Ottoman Empire is behaving more insolently toward English government than in the past? I almost think they were more sympathetic toward the Kaiser's ambitions in Europe than with being our ally." "You're very insightful," he said noncommittally. Committally? Am I saying that right? Non-committally?
Well, it sounds
non-committally.
Funny. I mean,
it just sounds so funny. It just rolls
it
off
does
the tongue.
sound funny, but that's their...
Speaking of the Ottomans and their
They could have said
Speaking of the Ottomans and their treatment of the Jews, she said, looking at Allison, the paper was asking for volunteers to help with food, clothing, medical care, and shelter. Pleased that her mother cared so deeply, a surge of pride filled Allison's heart. There was so little of her mother seemed concerned about when it came to either Egypt or Arabia. I thought I might try to stir up the English ladies to do something to help, said Eleanor. It seemed we ought to use our time more constructively than gossiping at bridge parties or watching our men battle it out on the polo field. By the way, Major Holden, do you play polo? The officers are in need of a good man since General Blaine hurt his back at Aleppo. From the looks of you, I would think the Brigadier's team would benefit tremendously from your participation. I'll mention you to the Brigadier's wife at the charity ball next Saturday. Giving no chance for Brett to respond, Eleanor turned again to her daughter. Beth wants to attend the ball with you this time. I haven't decided. 15 is rather young. Thinking of her sister, Allison smiled. I've the perfect dress for her. It's white and charming. Then perhaps I'll relent. It will do for a going-away party before we sail next month. The mention of the voyage to England brought Allison an uneasy moment as she remembered what Neil had told her in Mrs. Lyman's house. Her father would not be leaving his post as soon as her mother expected. Knowing how much it meant to her mother to return to England and settle down in the countryside, Allison wondered how she could rally the courage to disappoint her mother so soon after Leia's death and Neil's detention in Jerusalem. I'll tell Beth she can attend the ball tonight at dinner. Eleanor looked at Brett with a friendly smile. Won't you stay and dine with us, Major Holden? Brett had stood when the conversation between Allison and her mother turned social. Allison noted that he looked as if he were eager to depart. Thank you, but I can't stay. It's urgent I return to Cairo as soon as possible. Yes, the Jerusalem matter. I quite understand. I shouldn't have detained you. Thank you for escorting my daughter to Port Said. Major, perhaps we'll see you at the charity ball or the polo field. Brett's brief smile convinced Allison he had no interest in either at present. He would have his free time taken up by Lady Walsh and her niece, Cynthia. If I can make it, he said, and looked at her mother thoughtfully. He removed a sealed envelope and handed it to her. Allison thought she noticed restrained sympathy. Sir Westcott asked me to deliver this to you. Oh, a letter from Marshall? Yes. Strange. I expect him home this Thursday. I wonder that he didn't wait, or at least send me a wire. Allison, too, was surprised. Not over a letter coming from her father, for she suspected he had preferred to send it in the place of a wire to explain more fully and apologetically to Eleanor about the unwelcome change in their plans to leave Egypt. Allison was bewildered that Brett would have the letter. Had he carried it all the time they were in Arabia? Allison leaned over to her mother to catch a glimpse of the familiar handwriting belonging to Sir Westcott, as though she expected to have made a mistake. When had her father given him the letter? Had Brett been in Bombay? She cast him a curious glance, but he was watching her mother as if he knew she would be handed a disappointment. Allison concluded that if Brett hadn't deemed it of any interest to mention a girl named Cynthia, then it should not surprise her that he had not felt obliged to tell her of the letter he had received from her father. That he hadn't told her of either reinforced her conclusions that Brett was mysterious and careful. It was her mother's reaction to the letter that troubled Allison now. Brett told her mother goodbye and then turned to Allison. She was confronted by a polite but distant military demeanor, his eyes unreadable. I'll send word about Neil and David when I have something worthy to pass on. Goodbye, Miss Westcott. While her mother moved to the other side of the room with Marshall's letter, Brett walked from the sitting room to the entrance hall. The door opened and shut while Allison, glancing toward her mother to see her deep preoccupation with the letter, slipped away and ran after him. He was already crossing the front garden walkway. Major, wait! The sun had completely set, leaving traces of sapphire touching the sky. Sounds from the shipping canal weighed on the Mediterranean water as Allison brushed past the heavy stems of fragrant lilies and came to where he had stopped. Brett appeared to know what she would ask and was in no mood to explain more than he had inside the house. Instead of cooperation, she detected a slightly sardonic smile as he stood in the shadows of an overhanging jacaranda tree. This isn't a final goodbye. I wouldn't miss an opportunity to have a waltz with you at the charity ball. Momentarily off guard, she was speechless. Your conceit is detestable. That isn't why I came running after you. You can save your waltz for Cynthia, as I have no intention of being there. I've more important work to do with Aunt Lydia. Her words didn't seem to faze him. I need to catch one of the boats down the Nile. Boats run every hour, she stated tonelessly, and don't think I'm trying to keep you here for any reason except I would never presume. The proper demeanor of Miss Allison Westcott is beyond reproach and quite settled in my mind. You want to interrogate me about how I met your father, he smiled, and I'm determined to avoid that discussion, at least for now. If she weren't so concerned about matters, his polite but cool manner would have derailed her from proceeding. When did he give you the letter? He folded his arms. I don't remember. Maybe 2 months ago. That isn't true, is it, Major? 2 months ago, you were in Constantinople. I was. You told me at Carchemish. You only think I did. I told you I had previously been stationed in Constantinople. That might have been any time in the past. Her eyes narrowed as she studied his face in the starlight. He didn't intend to explain a thing. She could only assume he had his reasons, and that she must be content to wait until he decided to tell her more on his own initiative. She felt a rise of frustration, but restrained herself. He stood looking at her, the wind touching his dark hair and shirt. For a moment she felt as though something important could be slipping through her fingers as he disappeared out of her life. For even though he intimated he would see her at the charity ball, she was quite certain he had no intention of doing so. Allison knew that if she tried to grasp him, she would lose. Brett appeared just challenging enough to convince her that one too many women had tried to grasp and hold him before, and they had failed. She wondered about Cynthia. Had she come to lay her claim to his heart because he was expected to respond, or was she desperate to try to lay claim on him? Suddenly Allison believed she might feel sorry for the girl named Cynthia. Allison casually turned away. Very well, Major. I shall respect your wish for secrecy. If her change in attitude took him by surprise, he didn't let on. With dignity, she moved toward the house. Zuleika was turning on the lights, a room at a time, and the golden glow flooded the front terrace. Allison half hoped she would hear him call out for her to wait. He did not, and it wasn't until she climbed the steps to the terrace and opened the latch on the front door that she glanced back. Brett stood watching her. She could only guess what stirred in the tough mind of a man who wouldn't be easily ensnared by enemy or friend, especially by any woman who allowed the dreamy starlight to shine in her eyes when she looked at him. Allison entered the house and shut the door. She stood there in the shadows, looking toward the brightly lit sitting room where her mother would have read the letter by now. She heard Beth's voice exclaim with disappointment, "Not going to England? But what about my schooling? I'm sick to death of Egypt. Oh, Mother, can't we go anyway? Can't Father join us in a few months? And if we could surprise him by going out to the house in the country on weekends and getting it all ready? There's bound to be so much to do. You said I could decorate my own room." Allison swiftly walked into the room, and one glance saw her mother's look of disappointment, which she was trying to mask from Beth. Allison's understanding glance met her mother's and then swerved to Beth. Her sister took after their father's side of the family, with dark hair and earthy brown eyes. She was taller than Allison, a matter that always upset Beth, for she bemoaned that she couldn't wear heeled slippers at a ball because it would make her too tall. Neither did she appreciate her sultry appearance, but felt cheated that her eyes were brown instead of sea green, and that her hair was plain brown instead of shimmering with gold and auburn.
It's not
auburn.
green.
It's not green.
Yeah, but she's black.
I don't know why I had to be plain, oh, Miss Shue, she said. She had murmured more than once, and when assured she was anything but plain, she refused to accept the compliment. I look like an Egyptian, she would snap. If I were too long in the sun, I'd tan too easily. Life isn't fair. Now Beth, Anne, seeing her sister in the doorway, must have read the mild rebuke in Allison's gaze that told her she should have more concern for their mother's disappointment. I'll never attend a fashionable school like Geraldine and Francis, Beth said, and I've scrimped my allowance these past months to add to my wardrobe. You can attend music school here, said Eleanor vaguely. I was talking to Frederick Ritter just yesterday. He informed me he is opening a second school in Cairo, close to the museum. Baroness Helga Kruger highly recommends him as a Vienna instructor. Oh, Mother, why can't we just sail as planned? It's unfair of Father. Beth, do not speak so about your father. Mother is right, said Allison, quickly going to Beth, and sitting beside her on the sofa, she caught up Beth's hand. Anyway, the delay isn't going to be permanent, only a few more months. After that, it will be England as planned. That's easy for you to say. You've already gone home and attended nursing school. Beth, warned Eleanor, you're being rude to your sister and behaving badly. What's more, with the news of your cousin Leia's death and now Neil's detention in Jerusalem, this is no time to bemoan our own disappointments. We'll be having a memorial service for Leia tomorrow, and I expect some respect for the next few weeks. When your father arrives, well, we shall discuss the matter of England then. Beth's eyes welled with sudden tears. Sorry, I didn't know about Cousin Neil, but I hardly knew Leia. It doesn't matter, said Eleanor. She was your cousin. You'll show proper respect for her death. Yes, Mother. Did Father say exactly when he would arrive from Bombay? She asked hopefully. Eleanor sighed and turned toward the table where the crystal lamp gleamed down on the sheet of paper. Christmas, she said. He'll be home for the holidays. He'll be moving to Cairo. Allison caught the usage of he instead of we. Cairo, she asked. Then he's decided to stay on as Consul General. Unfortunately, he's promised to explain in more detail when he arrives. But I'm not so dense that I don't know what he plans. It seems Prime Minister Kitchener has asked him to remain in place indefinitely. Having been Consul General of Egypt himself, Kitchener believes it's important to have men in position who understand the Egyptian mind and the problems the nation faces while under Turkish suzerainty. Suzerainty. Serenity. Suzerainty. Suzerainty with British control of the Suez Canal. If war comes, protection of the canal's shipping lanes will be crucial for England. He feels your father is the most qualified of the men whom he could appoint to take the position. It grew uncomfortably still, and Allison saw something in her mother's usually quiet eyes that brought alarm. It was a flare of impatient anger. Her mother was far more frustrated with this decision than she was letting on in front of Beth. If Lady Westcott vented her frustrations now, Beth would have even more reason to join in and show disrespect for her father. Allison had always appreciated her mother when she was growing up because, despite the problems she faced in her marriage to Sir Westcott, she never spoke disparagingly about their father. Now that she was a woman, Allison could look back and remember times when her mother had gone to her room informing them she was ill, or had taken the carriage to visit the Reverend and his wife. At the time, Allison hadn't understood what was behind those visits to the Reverend or the long talks with his wife. Now she believed she knew they were an outpouring of her mother's unhappiness, and an attempt to avoid separation or divorce. Allison shivered a little, and tensed as she thought of her own future. Having seen so much unhappiness in her parents' marriage, she was reluctant to become seriously attached to any man. She felt she had already made one serious mistake by falling for Neville when she was only 16. She had thought she loved him desperately and had gone away to nursing school in England with a promise made between them that, upon graduation 4 years later, they would marry. In the second year of her training at Florence Nightingale's nursing school, the news arrived that Neville had married the daughter of a British colonel and had been transferred to Australia. The painful news had been the most disappointment she had yet experienced. 2 years later, after graduating and while attending Oswald Chambers Bible Training School in London, Training College in London, she had met Wade Finley, a godly and dedicated young man. They had become friends, and then slowly she had come to believe she had come to believe Wade was the man. The man the Lord intended her to marry to serve him here in Egypt. Allison in medicine with Aunt Lydia, Wade as a military chaplain stationed in Zeiton? Zeiton? Zeiton?
Sounds...
Okay. Zeiton. Beth stood morosely. I suppose there'll be no charity ball now that we're in mourning. Allison glanced across the room at her mother. She had been standing in the light of the lamp, simply staring at the letter as though transfixed in thoughts of her own. Her mother looked over at Beth, and seeing the downcast expression, she smiled. No, we can't cancel the ball. Leia was the kind of young woman who would have wished us to go, and the Moors of British Egypt are not Victorian England. We'll attend the memorial service I've arranged, then go on with our lives. I do think we ought to show some concern for Neil. I'd hoped your father would be home this weekend to send a protest to the Turkish ambassador, but no, I think I'll write the letter myself. An excellent idea, Mother, agreed Allison, and Major Holden will be reporting to his superiors in Cairo, too. Together, perhaps something can be done quickly. All we can do is try and pray. I'll go to Marshall's office and write it tonight. I'll have it posted officially in the morning on our way to the memorial service. And Beth, I've decided to permit you to attend the ball on Saturday. I expect a quiet demeanor, considering the family tragedy. Beth's brown eyes gleamed with excitement, but she struggled to look subdued. Yes, Mother, I won't wear any robe, so I shall look pale. Allison smothered a smile, and Rouge. Eleanor arched a brow. Rouge? You will not wear it on any occasion. You've enough youthful color in your cheeks already, and the white gown Allison is lending you will do much for your brunette hair. When Eleanor disappeared into her husband's office to write the dispatch to the Turkish officials, Beth turned to Allison and smiled happily. I can hardly wait to tell Geraldine and Francis. Geraldine?
Mm-hmm.
Geraldine. That sounds even weirder than Geraldine.
It's Geraldine.
Geraldine and Francis. They'll be green with envy. And Allison, may I use the little satin purse that goes with the dress, the one that snaps to the waist so prettily? Don't tell Mom, but I bought a lipstick. I want to carry it in the purse. Who knows, a handsome officer may prefer brunettes to redheads. Allison laughed despite herself. Yes, you may wear the beaded purse, but if you use lipstick, Mum will see it at once. Better stick to bringing a comb. Beth hurried upstairs to the bedrooms. I'll get the dress and bag from your wardrobe now. If it doesn't fit, we may need to lengthen the hem. After the memorial service the next morning, Allison had her first opportunity to speak with her mother alone. Beth had gone to spend the day with the Hollingsworth girls, Geraldine and Francis, and Allison was with her mother driving back from the church in a hired caleche, a horse-drawn carriage. This one was small with an open top, a torn leather seat, and faded carpet. I know you're disappointed about Father's decision, she said softly. Eleanor drew in a breath and looked out on the narrow, winding streets lined with tall houses with Marishbia wooden lattice covering the windows. I'm keeping it from Beth, but you might as well know. I'm taking your sister and leaving Egypt for England before Christmas. Allison swallowed, for her throat felt dry and aching. The decision hadn't been easy for her mother. Allison knew by the dark circles under her mother's gaze that she must have been up all night. Perhaps if he rode in Bombay, he would come here before Christmas. Eleanor turned and looked at Allison, her eyes hard with determination. I don't intend to write Marshall. I'm going to Bombay with Beth. We'll catch a vessel sailing to England from there. He'll either be on that ship with us, or it'll be over between us. I'll not come back here, ever. Allison stared at her, dumbfounded. You're going to India? Yes, I spoke with Reverend Ramborn this morning. That's why I was late. What I want to say to your father won't wait until he decides to arrive for the holidays. It must be decided between us as soon as possible. I can be in Bombay in a few weeks. I'll have 2 weeks or so to spend with him before the sailing season becomes difficult. I think he should know where matters stand between us. Allison had told herself she wouldn't intervene, she wouldn't argue with her mother for fear she would alienate her, but she hadn't expected the decision to come so soon or with such determination. Mother, is it wise to offer such an ultimatum? I mean, you know Father, he's bullheaded indeed. No, dear, I know quite what I'm doing. It's been coming to this hour for years, and I'm afraid I've reached the point at which it's rather late to turn back. It's our marriage or his career. He'll need to choose now what he wants, because I've had quite as much as I can endure of this life. I was rather hard on Beth last night, but I agree with her longings. She dislikes Egypt as much as I, and I want her to have the kind of life I didn't have. I won't have her marrying some soldier and being forced into foreign service in the Sudan, India, or Egypt. Her mother was serious. She had made up her mind. Allison lapsed into painful silence, torn between understanding and sympathy for her mother and love and compassion for her father. She loved both of them and understood both of their wishes and differences. She knew she must somehow avoid siding with one against the other. The emotional dilemma was almost too much to endure. She was glad her mother wouldn't tell Beth yet. How will you explain to Beth? Won't she guess why the two of you are sailing to Bombay? No, she'll be told it was planned that your father will go with us to England from India. Allison searched her eyes. And when he doesn't? Eleanor smiled wearily. So you too assume he'll set out for Egypt instead of his wife? Mother, I didn't mean that. I only meant that if Prime Minister Kitchener has personally ordered him to stay on as Consul General, that he'll find himself between the devil and a stone wall. An ultimatum is likely to drive a further wedge between the two of you, even if he sails with you and Beth for London. He isn't likely to forget you twisted his arm. Deep in his heart, he'll resent you for forcing him to make such a decision when he wasn't ready. Eleanor's eyes flashed and unexpected tears came. I've endured for the last 10 years, and does he care? I've always taken the last place in his agenda, in his duties, in the honorable demands placed upon him. I live in emotional isolation, and I'm weary of pretending that I have sacrificed. Pretending I have sacrificed enough. Her voice rose to a pitch that Allison had never heard before, and she threw her arms around her mother. Mother, I'm sorry. I'm not lecturing. I'm not being critical. I love you dearly. I wish I could have helped you more, but I didn't know how. Her mother stiffened to hold back any sob that might escape and squeezed Allison's arm. After a moment, she said too calmly, There's no reason for you to have any guilt, darling. It wasn't your burden any more than it's Beth's now. But you must understand, I've sorted through this years ago. It's only Beth's schooling that has brought the final decision. It's only Beth's schooling that has brought the final decision now. They lapsed into silence. The sounds of Port Said filled the air. I'm tired, said Eleanor in a dull, flat voice. I've shared him with everyone else all our married life. I wanted these last years to be for us alone. I was planning on it. Now he's been taken from us again, and Marshall permitted it. He knew I'd leased the house in the country. I even sent for the fruit trees to surprise him, and now he's allowed Kitchener to talk him into staying in Arabia. I've lived my life giving to others. We all came last, and her voice snapped, and she dropped her head into her hands, her shoulders shaking. Mother, whispered Allison, her throat tense and hurting, I'm so sorry. Chapter 17. Allison didn't want to disappoint her mother, especially in light of Lady Westcott's recent decision, Leia's death, and Neil's incarceration. Yet Allison felt she couldn't voyage with her mother and Beth to Bombay and then to England, even though her mother seemed to think she would. You'll have much more opportunity to advance in nursing in England. How could Allison explain that advancement wasn't what she wanted, but that it was her desire to fulfill a mission she felt called by God to pursue? The day of the polo match and the charity ball, she learned from Beth that their mother had bought a passage for the three of them. What are you going to do? Asked Beth, watching her intently. How can you stay here alone? Think of the gossip. It's just not fitting for an unmarried woman to be on her own in Egypt. Allison knew all this well enough and had struggled to come up with an answer for the last 2 days. I'm not leaving, she said quietly, removing her dress for the day from the amour. I've trained hard for my career in medicine, and this is where I belong. Besides, I won't be alone. You're forgetting Aunt Lydia. I'll be with her most of the time. When I'm not, well, I can come home to Port Said, to the house. Zalika will be here, and maybe Aunt will come as well. She's getting old. Despite her insistence, she feels as strong as ever. After Leia and now Cousin Neil, Mother will be upset if you stay. I know she will, said Allison quietly, frowning to herself. But honestly, Beth, it isn't fair to expect me to drop everything I've worked so hard for to leave now. You sound like Father. Allison looked at her, surprised at the comparison. She hadn't thought of it before. Maybe she was a little like her father. Lydia needs me on the Nile. There's concern of a typhoid outbreak near the Thebes. Right? The Thebes?
Let me see.
The Thebes. You have...
Is it
you?
the...
You can have ancient Thebes, she said. All those huge images of pharaohs. Zalika says the Valley of Kings is haunted by evil spirits. If it's haunted by anything, it's archaeologists, said Allison dryly. Anyway, I'll need to do my best to make Mother understand. I'll promise to come home once a year for a visit. Beth sadly shook her head, her dark curls swaying. She was working to pin them up as she copied Allison's sophisticated hairdo. You know, Mum, she'll be scandalized if you stay on without her. Allison fumbled with her zipper and pinched her skin. Ouch. Oh, bother. I don't know why I'm going to such a fuss. I don't even want to go to the polo match or the ball. Beth smiled mischievously as she helped Allison with the zipper. You're not fooling me. I got a glimpse of him. Actually, it was more than a glimpse. I watched him from the stairs, and I know why you want to go. She sighed. He's almost too good looking. Except for that little scar on his chin, but it looks so masculine. Allison met Beth's eyes in the mirror. I am not going because of Brett Holden. He won't even be there. Yes, he will, said Beth confidently. There, zipper's in place. And you look stunning. Oh, sometimes I hate you. Her eyes skimming over the folds of pale blue silk with gleaming threads of silver. Beth, you know what I mean, silly. Not really hate, but you're so pretty, and I feel so tall and gangly. You're 15. You'll fill out plenty. Next time I see you in London, you'll be all grown up. Hand me that wrap. Why did you say the Major would be there? He won't. He's in Cairo. I know he'll be there because I heard General Blaine telling everyone Major Holden agreed to fill in for him, at least for today. It's the last game, and the Brigadier was up in arms about the loss. So General Blaine went to Major Holden and talked him into it. What? Rhett joined the Brigadier's team? I don't believe it. Why? Allison shrugged. Because he's easily bored by such things. I don't think he cares much about anything except, she had wanted to say, working in British intelligence, but then realized that Beth didn't know, nor did anyone else except her mother and father. Except what? Asked Beth curiously. Allison was at a loss. I'm surprised he has agreed it as all. Well, he did. The Brigadier says he plays well and rides aggressively, whatever that means. And it means he can ride a horse and hit the ball with the best of them. Beth glanced toward the door, looking back at Allison over her shoulder. Cynthia's coming too. I saw her. She's even prettier than you. Looking sympathetic, she sighed. Dreadful bit of luck. She opened the door and went out, leaving it ajar as usual. Allison's unsettled emotions held her in a vice of unease. Beth was right. Cynthia Walsh could grace the cover of Vogue Fashion magazine. Allison calmly told herself she had no reason to write for fear or jealousy. But she is dreadfully uppity, said Sarah Blaine to Allison.
What?
Uppity, said Sarah Blaine to Allison later that day, smoothing back a strand of gray-tinged hair from her temple. If she holds her chin much higher, I fear she will have a neck strain. General Blaine leaned toward his wife and stroked his mustache. My dear, you're being terribly catty tonight. Meow indeed, said Sarah, leaning back in her lawn chair. The three of them were sitting on the edge of the polo grounds watching the match. I'm not the only cat who thinks this, so I wonder how she could bear to leave London for Egypt. The answer to that is no mystery at all, interjected Allison with a little smile, her eyes following Major Brett Holden on the racing polo pony. Oh, yes, said Sarah, watching the game over the rim of her lemon slush. So I've heard from Miss Walsh. She's suggesting a fat diamond will soon weigh down the delicate hand of our Vogue miss. Come all the way to the land of the pharaohs to get it, I suppose, said General Blaine, adjusting his sunglasses lower on his nose. Well, I don't blame her, but you girls don't know everything. And they say men don't gossip, taunted Sarah to Allison with a wink. Out with it, Rex, she said, nudging his arm with her elbow. You mustn't make us suffer so. What have you learned? About Miss Vogue or him? Him, of course. Allison's interested, naturally. Sarah? Uh-oh, said the general, lowering his glasses to peer at Allison. Uh-oh, what? Allison said with a laugh. He may be staked and claimed by dear Cynthia, but she's only one of a long line who think they've discovered gold, or should I say the latest archaeological treasure. Allison bit the rim of her glass, watching Brett Holden, but Sarah turned her petite head toward her husband. What are you saying, Rex? My dear, don't you know anything? He mimicked in the tone of a dowager. The man is a cat, and has left many a broken heart along the romantic trail as he proceeds undaunted toward new conquests. I hadn't heard that, said Sarah, but I had heard he speaks Arabic and a bit of Turkish rather well, a commodity of interest in London, maybe a smidgen of German too. Allison took a sip of her lemon slush and tried to change the subject. He plays polo well. Where did you hear about him speaking other languages? Asked General Blaine. Sarah wrinkled her nose at him. My dear, don't you know anything? Not nearly enough. Must we worry about our Allison? No, said Allison, setting down her glass. You're both overlooked the fact that I'm practically engaged to Wade Finley, who will be arriving next year, and it appears Major Holden has already proceeded on his way, undaunted where I'm concerned. He's not glanced my way since Cynthia arrived with Lady Walsh. You see, said General Blaine, he's an impossible prospect. Allison's much too sensible and dedicated to higher causes to waste her time. Thank you, Rex, said Allison with a smile. I didn't think you had noticed. About the higher cause, I mean. Ouch. She's right, dear. We haven't been to church in months. Not so. What did we do the other night if it wasn't adorn the cathedral with our good taste in clothing and jewels? And I saw Reverend Radborn give your blue eye. I saw Reverend Radborn giving your blue bead the evil eye, he said, looking pointedly at the turquoise stone she wore around her neck. They usually wear crosses. He said. You're heathen, Sarah Sweet. Oh, posh, and that wasn't exactly attending a worship service, but a memorial for poor Leah Bristow. I still shudder when I think of that afternoon out at the abandoned digs. It was dreadful to find her that way. Now, you'll cast clouds of doom and gloom all over Allison's pretty head. Let's not embark on the accident at Aleppo. Except I'm still smarting from my own accident. That sprain in my back hasn't healed, Allison, he said, looking toward her over his glasses. Haven't you a smidgen more of something to help besides sugar pills? Aunt Lydia has on the boat. Dear, dear Lydia. I haven't seen the saint in 3 years. How's she doing? As spry as ever. I'll be seeing her soon. She is on the boat down the Nile at the Thebes? How do you say it? Are you asleep? The Thebes? Is it the Thebes or the Thebes? The Thebes? The Thebes. The Thebes.
Mm-hmm.
You know Luxor, as it's called today. I'm used to hearing the archaeologists call it by its ancient name. I've plans to go there soon. Come along, you and Sarah both. She would be delighted to see you. And try out her new voodoo techniques on my back. Rex, scolded Sarah. I'll consider, said General Blaine. We ought to drop her a line first to let her know we're coming. I suppose she receives mail on the medical boat? All the conveniences, says Allison with a smile. Anyway, you know the British consuls along the route. You can write the Mercy from anywhere, and the mail will be held for Lydia at the residences. Do come. You haven't seen the latest finds. The Valley of the Kings is the richest spot for pyramids and tombs. Don't mention tombs, said Sarah, lifting her shoulders with a little chill. Two accidents at Aleppo are quite enough for me. If I come, I'll view the sights from the Mercy. A Nile voyage sounds pleasant enough. And if you come, said Allison, you'll both be saving me an unwanted voyage to Bombay. Bombay? Whatever for? Don't tell me Marshall isn't coming home yet, asked Sarah with a frown. And Eleanor will be up in arms. I'm afraid she is, said Allison. She's sailing with Beth to see him about it. She wants me to go too, but if I travel to Luxor with you and Rex, she'll be more apt to accept my not wanting to quit my work to go home to England. The Blaines to the rescue, said Rex, patting his rounded belly. I do hope Lydia knows how to cook. Since Allison had returned from Arabia, everything that had occurred during the meeting of the Cairo Archaeological Club had seemed to fade from reality. Even Jerusalem seemed distant, another world, and while she was concerned about Neil and David, she was sure the British government would soon be on their case, arranging for a release. She wondered if Brett Holden had brought any news from Cairo, but with the arrival of Lady Walsh and her niece Cynthia, Allison was reluctant to make any move in his direction. She was also, if she would admit it, a little put out because
attaining this affect.
Oh, okay.
I think that's it.
I think I might have accidentally skipped some on the recording, but oh well. Not much has happened. We're just chatting about things. Don't be silly, darling. One doesn't lecture about archaeology at a charity dance. We waltz about it in tune to simply lovely strains while the Egyptian moon shines like a fiery globe. Sounds like a fine spot to take a nap under the violins, and with my back, I won't feel like promenading about the waxed floor. I can see it now. You and the Turkish professor doing the Spanish tango. It's enough to begin the war. Jamal doesn't dance, tango, or waltz. That reminds me, Allison. I still haven't wooed that invitation to the Christmas extravaganza Baroness Kruger's giving at her house in Alexandria. Eleanor promised to put in a word for me, but I've heard nothing from Helga. Do remind Eleanor before she sails for Bombay, will you? I may not be able to see her off. Rex needs to go into Cairo next week. But hopefully we'll be back before the voyage to Luxor, said Rex. When do you plan to leave? Soon after Mum and Beth leave. Oh, hello. Speaking of the grave-faced Sultan, here he comes, said General Blaine. Allison looked up to see Professor Jamal amble toward their lawn chairs. His lean face shadowed beneath his smoke blue turban. Otherwise, he was all in black with a Western-style knee-length frock coat. Never trust a man who wears a winter coat in late July, whispered General Blaine behind his cupped hand, sending Sarah and Allison into smothered giggles. Hello, Jamal. Playing polo, are you? Asked General Blaine, while raising his hefty frame with its protruding belly from his chair. I didn't know you all-brain archaeologists had the other kind of outdoor stuff in you, only spades and shovels and mummy graves. Sarah rolled her eyes in despair and reached for a fan, but Allison laughed. They don't use such crude tools, Rex. Professor Jamal especially. Sorry. Don't be, General Blaine, said Jamal with a wan, forgiving smile as he nodded his turbaned head. I wouldn't expect a retired military man to know much about digging. A benign rebuke, graciously taken. Who won the game, do you know? The Brigadier's team. I think. I wasn't watching, but they seemed to be celebrating. Although I did think I heard the Brigadier toast your sprained back. Hi, said Rex with a laugh. I've underestimated your sense of humor. I thought it was as lacking as the Sultan's palace as it is in Berlin. I thought it was lacking in the Sultan. Oh dear, I seem to have splashed my lemon slush, said Sarah. Yes, on me, said General Blaine. You might be a little more subtle in your rebukes, Sarah dear. I think she just gave me my cue to take a stroll. He remarked jovially to Jamal as he snatched...
What's the little sister's name?
Beth?
Okay.
Yep. As he snatched up his empty glass. I'll meander into the club for a refill and leave you three to chat old bones. Allison stood as well. I'm afraid I must leave too. That's Beth coming now. Ready, Allison? Beth called from the edge of the dusty polo ground. The supper was held in the gardens of the British Club, while the large communal ballroom extending off the courtyard was being readied by locals for the dance. The sky behind the feathery date palms at the far end of the garden was turning from blue gold to warm shades of rose and orange, and the breathless air hung with the fragrance of roses oddly mixed with outdoor cooking. Allison was hardly in a festive mood, unlike the days and nights following her arrival home, which had wrapped her in a comfortable complacency of the familiar. She had come to feel as though something were not quite right. She had no idea what disturbed her ease, but as she sat in the garden having supper and hearing the lull between the rise and fall of voices and laughter, a certain foreboding came to her on the first stir of breeze that rustled the leaves on the tall oleander bush she sat beside. The night was growing darker. The light from the lanterns that hung in the trees was surrounded by bugs, and the lanterns cast swaying shadows on the stone courtyard. She left her half-eaten food on the plate for the servants to carry away later, and looking toward the ballroom, she noticed that no one had arrived there yet. It stood in shadows, too, except under the lights hung from the high ceiling above the orchestra stand. Someone was waiting in the unlighted ballroom, she realized. Was it Beth? She walked into the room, drawn there like a moth beating its wings against a bulb. Looking across the polished floor toward the stage where the light flooded down, she saw the musical instruments were all there. The curtain behind the stage stirred as if a wind had rustled its soiled hem. Had Beth gone back there? Allison walked through the shadows toward the lighted stage and stopped. "Beth," she called. Had her senses deceived her, Beth did not step out from behind the curtain, nor did she answer. Allison had been so sure it was Beth that she walked toward the steps on the side of the stage and started to go behind the curtain, when an odd sensation gripped her. In a moment she was relieving the terror of entering Major Carr-Wooder's hut following Leia. Leia was dead, the British agent was dead, and a step behind her made her turn swiftly, expectantly. It was only an Egyptian in a long white galabeas and cloth wrapped around his head, his tan face and dark eyes as emotionless as the death mask of an ancient pharaoh. "Oh," she whispered, "you frightened me." He bowed his head. "Very sorry, madame." He walked past to the other side of the large room, his feet silent, and switched on a blaze of lights. The ball was to begin momentarily, and the musicians were drifting in from a side door, but not from behind the curtain. Had she seen someone go back there? If not Beth, who and why? "I'm being silly," she thought. "It's the tragedy of Mum and Father, of so much about Neil and David being unsettled, and because I'm not enjoying today. I shouldn't have come. It was a mistake." She felt foolish standing on the side steps of the stage in the limelight, and swiftly retraced her steps, aware that several heads had turned in her direction. She went out the side door the musicians had used and found herself on the other side of the garden, where some low recreational buildings in the form of bungalows were located. They were dark, and she assumed locked. She wondered if she might not just go home when she nearly bumped into a tall, gaunt figure that emerged from a side door from the back stage. Jamal bowed his head in greeting. "You are lost, Miss Westcott." Well, yes, I suppose I am. Terribly embarrassing me. I thought—" She stopped, for he stood looking down at her with large, impassive eyes that showed neither humor nor friendliness. He looked like quite a different person from the archaeology professor who held lectures and tours of the Aleppo huts, or the friendly guest who had stopped to chat at the Blaine table near the polo grounds earlier in the afternoon. His expression changed, and his mouth moved into a wide smile. "The door is this way behind you. The music has begun. May I have the first waltz?" She swallowed, nearly choking. Oh, bother. Sarah had been wrong about his dancing. The last thing Allison wanted was to return to waltz, especially with this rather frightening, somber man. But how could she possibly refuse him without appearing to be a British snob? Why, yes. As they entered the ballroom, walking to the center of the floor, Allison felt conspicuous. For only a few couples were there for the first song, and the chairs along the side of the pale blue walls were filled. People were still arriving and standing in the doorway, chatting as they did. So are you going to the Thebes? He asked congenially. "Yes, how did you know?" "Mrs. Blaine mentioned it. I envy you. The Valley of the King lures me there as often as I can get away from the university." "Have you heard from your other cousin, Neil Bristow? When you ran off the way you did, we thought you had gone to meet him at Carchemish." "Yes, we have heard from him. Business has taken him to Jerusalem, and he ran into a bit of trouble there with your Turkish General Pasha. He's being held now. You couldn't intervene in any way, could you?" "My general, Miss Westcott. He is not my general. I have no heart for war. I am a professor, and as such stay out of politics." "Yes, I didn't mean— I am sorry about your cousin. I hope the matter isn't as serious as one might think. However, since I do not know the Turkish officials at Jerusalem, there is little I can do for Neil. Nevertheless, I will certainly call upon Ishmet Bey in Cairo," he said of the Turkish official. "Perhaps he will look into the matter." "Anything you could do would be appreciated. By the way, Professor, I've been concerned about the lamp at Durables Expedition House. Shouldn't the museum safeguard it until Neil can return to the digs there?" "A lamp? Unfortunately, I've not seen it. Is it valuable?" "Oh, but you must have seen it at Neil and Leia's house. It can't be missed. It's right in the sitting room." His shadow's eyes were blank. "I have not been to the Bristol house in Durables, only out to the digs last year, so I would not know of the piece you speak of. I will mention it to Baroness Kruger." "But the letter—" she began, then wisely stopped. "The letter? Oh, I do beg your pardon, Professor Jamal. There, I've gone and stepped on your polished shoe. How clumsy of me." "It is nothing," he said stiffly. "Oh, but it is very beastly of me." "Please, it is nothing." "I feel like such a bore." Just then, someone jostled her, pushing her to the side. She turned, grateful for the interruption. Brett, with Cynthia Walsh. said, "Excuse me, rather clumsy of us. Oh, hello, Professor. I see you've decided to stay after all. Can't blame you." He looked at Allison with a disarming smile that told her the interruption hadn't been an accident. "Pleasant evening, isn't it?" She scanned him briefly, noting how well he wore the British uniform, a far cry from Colonel Holman with the Iron Cross. It was the first time she had seen him looking so British, and the uniform fit his personality as well as it did his masculine build. "Rather warm, I was thinking," said Jamal, and his sad eyes ran over Brett's military rating. "I didn't know you were in Cairo intelligence, Major." "Unfortunate bit of luck. My commanding officer had me transferred with him. I speak some Arabic, and he doesn't. I'd rather have stayed in Constantinople." Brett turned casually to the raven-haired woman on his arms, who was eyeing Allison. "Cynthia, have you met the most brilliant Egyptianologist about? This is Professor Jamal. Professor Miss Cynthia Wash. She's here for a visit from England." Jamal bowed with stately charm, no doubt warmed by Brett's extravagated compliment. It isn't like the Major to be so warm and generous with his choice of words, thought Allison. Cynthia merely smiled and ignored Allison, snapping open a small lace fan and swishing it. Cynthia glanced about. "It is dreadfully warm in here, Brett." "Since you were commenting on the heat as well, Professor, perhaps you wouldn't mind being the envy of every gentleman here and tending to Miss Walsh for the next few minutes." Brett turned to look at Allison, smiling briefly. "Nurse Westcott, I'd like to discuss a matter with you during the next dance. Would you mind if I tore you away from the brilliant professor? I promise not to keep you long." Not waiting for an answer, Brett smoothly deposited the surprised Cynthia on Professor Jamal's arm and took a hold of Allison at the same moment. He drew her away onto the ballroom floor. Allison smiled sweetly. "By your pragmatic form of address, Major Holden, I assume you need to discuss my recommendation for the alleviation of some new form of disease." He smiled, unperturbed. "Yes, I find that I'm often seriously misunderstood with Miss Westcott. Do you think you can help me?" Her contrary smile continued. "No. Another hope crushed. But I imagine Cynthia would be quite obliging." At that moment, the band struck up a noisy quick-step with a clash of cymbals and drums. Allison smiled victoriously. "Somehow I can't imagine Colonel Holman doing a Spanish fandango with Fräulein." She laughed softly. "Of course, if you're willing to try." His sardonic smile flickered, and he drew her away toward the side door, which opened onto the back side of the garden. Allison, realizing he was leading her to the place where she had nearly bumped into Professor Jamal earlier, held back. "Don't worry, our little stroll is strictly business." "Why should I think it otherwise?" "You're not disappointed?" he asked with polite innocence. She looked up at him, resisting the dark blue intensity of his gaze. "Let's not debate now," he said. "My little exchange with Jamal and Miss Walsh worked like a charm, didn't it?" "Miss Walsh, how formal of you, considering she's expecting a solitaire on her engagement finger." "Well then, very well. Then, Cynthia, I see my private concerns are fast making the rounds of female gossip. As a matter of fact, I learned it from a man, General Blaine. Charming. That makes all the difference." "It makes absolutely no difference to me. I didn't come to discuss Cynthia, and if you don't mind, I'd like to leave that for what it is, a personal matter." Stung, she lapsed into silence, more angry with herself than Brett. Whatever had gotten into her? She would never have permitted herself to behave this way before. What had she expected from him? Did she think he would try to convince her there was nothing between Miss Walsh and him? What right did she have to expect him to explain, or to assume he wouldn't care for someone? "I'm sorry, I deserve that," she began. "No," he interrupted softly, "you didn't. You deserve much better than I can offer, but this isn't the time for sentimentality. I know, I'm trying to pronounce it. Sentimentality. Sentimentality is not one of your weaknesses. Another personal matter. Now, about Professor Jamal, I could see you were trapped and got you out of it, but for a reason. I want to know what he wanted of you. He's not a dancer." "You're the second person who's told me that. Then I guess I should be flattered he broke his own rule and asked me for the first waltz. What makes you suspect I was trapped?" "Well, weren't you?" "Yes, but how did you know?" I followed you inside the ballroom when it was still empty. I saw you start up the stairs to go behind the curtain. I was about to stop you when you took a swift exit out the side door, only to meet Jamal coming from the stage. But it wasn't the professor who went behind the curtain. What makes you so sure? Because just why was she... Oh, crack. Oh, okay. Never mind. Just why was she certain? Because he was coming from the other garden when I met him. He made it look that way, then deliberately startled you by asking you to dance. His action took your mind off seeing him go behind the curtain. Am I right? She realized it had. I used the same tactic on him when I startled him by stepping on his polished shoe, then behaving like a ninny for repeatedly apologizing. It worked. He forgot my mistake. His alert gaze sought and searched hers. Your mistake? What mistake? What was it you wanted him to forget? She didn't explain at first, but why would he slip away behind the stage curtain, and why did he pretend he hadn't been there? After all, he could have made some simple excuse and let the matter go. I thought it was my sister, Beth. Why did he go there? I was going to ask you that. I thought you knew and had decided to play detective again and follow him. A reckless decision. Follow him? Why would I want to? And how do you know all this? He took her arm and walked her across the court. Because I've been keeping an eye on you, whether you think so or not. She concealed her pleasure. Have you really been watching me? Then maybe that was what I sensed earlier. He looked at her curiously. What do you mean? She remembered the odd sensation she had felt earlier in the garden during the outdoor supper. It seemed silly to try to explain. Somehow she thought Brett would attribute it to feminine instincts. Not wishing to appear foolish, she tried to avoid the subject. I guess I was just feeling nervous. I think it's more than that, came his sober reply. Don't forget, the information Leia and Reuter were killed for is still missing, and someone may think you have it. You haven't forgotten, have you? Has Port Said changed your thinking that much? He wasn't playing games with her, and she realized she should have known he wouldn't. Brett didn't play games. His expression was grave. No, I haven't forgotten. How could I? His hand on her arm tightened. This isn't the place to talk. He led her further into the back garden. Do you think it's proper to escort Nurse Westcott into the Egyptian night? She asked in a breezy attempt at indifference. I gather from the withering looks you throw my way, you don't like to be called by your professional title. He smiled a little invitation. What else do I dare call you? Never mind. Was it really true what you told Professor Jamal about your commanding officer arranging your transfer to Cairo because he needed you? Something like that, he responded evasively. I take it it's not quite that simple. You do, however, speak Arabic because Sarah said so. Who is Sarah? General Blaine's wife. I told you about them in Jarablus. I see you've been discussing the curious Major Holden. What else did she have to say? That you speak some Turkish. Language was a major study for me. It's crucial in my work. You mean espionage? I wish you wouldn't say it out loud. Anyone else bring it up? By now, everyone knows you work at Cairo Intelligence, even Professor Jamal. He mentioned it tonight. Yes, pretending surprise. He already knew, but you're right. Everyone does know, but working in intelligence is not the same as being a foreign agent. So remember to play coy when I become the topic of conversation. What did the Blaines tell you about me? He persisted. As they walked into the lawn, she looked at him sideways. I was warned, she said bluntly. His mouth turned in wry amusement. I see. Suppose I tell you all the talk is part of my cover. You mean, Major, you don't have a dozen fair beauties like Cynthia out to lure you into a matrimonial trap? She asked with faint and false innocence. He laughed and escorted her across the lawn, but she noticed he didn't answer the question. He helped her to sit in a lawn chair made of wicker and stood looking down at her for a moment. The smile was gone, and so was the casual conversational style. A frown showed on his handsomely chiseled face. Let's get serious, Allison. I want to know what made you think you needed to be careful with Jamal. I need to be careful with everyone. You told me that in Jarablus, and so I have. His eyes narrowed, and he folded his arms, obviously unimpressed with her explanation. Yes, but what did he ask you? Nothing important. Let's see. Oh, yes, he asked about whether or not I'd heard from Neil. You told him? He asked with interest. I didn't see any reason not to. Shouldn't I have? For a moment he considered a query. I suppose it doesn't matter. The news of his detention in Jerusalem is out. Which reminds me, you haven't heard anything yet? No, unfortunately. We're working on it in Cairo. So far, the Turks have been typically uncooperative. He grew thoughtful, as though something bothered him. What is it? She asked him quietly. They're insisting they don't have Neil. Is that unusual? She asked tensely. No, but it strikes me as odd since they admit to holding David. I wonder. She wasn't to know what he wondered, for an Egyptian serving man came softly across the lawn carrying a tray of cool refreshments for those who had opted to leave the ballroom. Brett gestured, and the man came over offering the tray. Handing her a cool lemonade, Brett took a frosted glass for himself and sat opposite her. After the man had gone, he asked quietly, "What else did Jamal ask?" "Let's see. He asked if I was going to the Thebes soon." He watched her over the glass rim. "Luxor, are you?" "Yes, my work with Aunt Lydia." She wondered what he thought about her missionary work. He frowned lightly, fingering the frosted glass. "I wish you wouldn't go yet. It makes it much more difficult for me to keep an eye on you. If you must leave, why not go with your mother and sister to Bombay?" "How did you know about Bombay?" She smiled. Is that bit of work also part of your espionage?" If it was, he preferred to ignore her half-hearted question. "Your mother asked me to arrange passage." "Odd that she would ask you. You're going as an escort?" "You're going as escort." "Not a chance. I was stationed in India for the first 5 years of my service. How do you expect to convince your mother to let you stay on here alone? My impression of her is that of a great lady with precise beliefs." Allison smiled wistfully. "She is all of that, and I hope you're not implying that I lack propriety by not sailing with her." "My dear, you're the paradigm of culture and innocence. Complimenting Lady Westcott wasn't intended to throw a shade across your path. I was merely hoping she would exert influence over you where I cannot. I wish you would either stay in Port Said or go with your mother." "Thank you, Major," she said too gravely, sipping her lemon slush. His mouth turned. "Not for any reason except your safety. You would be better off returning to England with your family and forgetting all that's happened in Arabia." "Do you really think I can?" she asked gravely, remembering Leia. "No, but for your sake, you would be wise to try." She hastened to say, "I'm of age for one thing, so my mother won't insist. She respects my interest in nursing with Aunt Lydia. She respects my interest in nursing with Aunt Lydia. I hate to disappoint my mother, though. Anyway, I won't be alone. The Blands are coming to Luxor, too, for a few weeks' stay. I'll be with my aunt on the boat and with friends." He frowned. "Can't Luxor wait? It's a good distance from Cairo, and I'll be tied up there for a time. I can't keep tabs on you." The idea of Brett keeping watch was more comforting than she wanted to admit, even if the reason was for quite another purpose than romantic interest. "I'll be perfectly safe in Luxor, busy, as a matter of fact, with a myriad of inoculations against typhoid. Aunt Lydia is expecting the medicine to arrive soon. She'll have things ready when I get there." He watched her with an unexpected intensity that made her skin tingle. "Saving the children, I gather, is the reason you're willing to risk journeying up and down the Nile. I admit it fits you well." "If that's a compliment, Major, thank you. I'm surprised." "You shouldn't be." So Jamal asked about Luxor. What exactly did he want to know? "Only if I was going. Sarah had mentioned it earlier. He's interested because of the pyramids and monuments, of course." He seemed satisfied. "All right. Now, why did you find it necessary to make him forget by stepping on his shoe?"
Yeah.
Allison set down her glass, wiping the dripping moisture onto the napkin. "It was a letter I found in Leia's bedroom at Jarablus." She stopped, looking past Brett. Her expression must have shown how startled she was, for he stood and turned. Major Holden, said Baroness Helga Kruger, coming from the lawn shadow. "The brigadier said I might find you here." "Ah, Allison, it is timely to see you again safe, and in congenial company. I will not lecture, but you did give us all a dreadful moment when you disappeared at the hut so soon after Miss Brister was found dead." Eleanor explained to me what happened, however. Allison said, "I regret I couldn't leave a message for you, Baroness." "Couldn't?" "David was in such a hurry to get to Jerusalem. He knew Neil Brister was there on archaeology business," interjected Brett, taking control of the conversation. "You'll be interested to see his pieces for the museum when General Pasha agrees to release him. We were hoping you would put in a good word for him." I do not know General Pasha. No, of course you wouldn't. He said it honestly enough, but somehow Allison wondered if he meant it. The Baroness seemed to hesitate as well. I had your friends at the museum in Constantinople in mind, said Brett. Sometimes civilians in responsible places can have a quiet impact on government officials. Yes, that is a possibility. I will send a wire in the morning. Anything to be of help. Brett gave a brief bow of his head. You are a woman of rare insight, Baroness. That fact has not gone unnoticed by the British officials. You wished to see me about a matter. Yes, but I would not want to interrupt. She looked pointedly at Allison. Allison recognized the hint. A glance at Brett showed he wasn't pleased with Helga's interruption, but his bland gaze told Allison it might be better to cooperate. I must be going anyway, said Allison. It's time I looked up Beth to see how she's faring. This is her first ball. Brett drew back a chair to clear a path. Good night. I'll do what I can about your cousin, he repeated as though she had been meeting with him about Neil. I'll be in touch from Cairo by letter or wire. Thank you, Major. Good night. She turned to Helga, who...
Okay, was she a...
Thank you, Major. Good night. She turned to Helga, who watched her, a subdued hint of curious in her brown eyes. So good to see you again, Baroness. Yes, and I hope to see you at some of my dinner parties this year. You must come and bring Sarah Blaine with you. Sarah would be delighted. The Baroness smiled as though the matter was settled and turned to sit in the chair that Allison had vacated. Allison walked across the velvety lawn back toward the clubhouse where the bright lights in the ballroom glittered like diamonds in the hot night. Had Helga overheard her mention the letter she had found in Leia's bedroom in Jarablus? She was reminded that she had been so busy since her arrival that she hadn't gone through the stack of papers and letters from Leia's dresser drawer. I'll do it tonight, she said. Brett will want to know what was in the letter. I suppose he'll be in touch before he leaves Port Said for Cairo. Obviously, Helga hadn't seen Brett at Aleppo in the disguise of Colonel Brett Holman, nor had Professor Jamal. Had anyone else? She wondered. She didn't think so. How could they? Someone would have mentioned it. Nor would Brett be so casual about showing himself for who he was. Allison was interested in what Helga wanted of him and wondered if he would explain. He probably would not. End of chapter.